Hey there, welcome to 3+Hours. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever felt like something was watching you from the corner of an empty room? That sensation of eyes following your every move, even when you're certain you're alone? I never believed in ghosts until I took the night watchman position at Oak Ridge Elementary. The job seemed simple enough: patrol the premises, make sure no teenagers broke in looking for thrills, and report any maintenance issues. Nothing I couldn't handle after 15 years working security at the mall downtown. My name is Robert Keller, though most people call me Bob. At 47, with thinning gray hair and a slight limp from an old football injury, I wasn't exactly the picture of an intimidating security guard. But I was reliable, punctual, and desperate for work after the mall downsized their security team. When the school board posted the job opening, I applied immediately. The school superintendent, Mrs. Henderson, gave me a brief tour on my first day. Oak Ridge Elementary was split into two buildings. The newer wing, built in the early 2000s, housed the current students and staff, while the original structure, dating back to the 1950s, stood abandoned behind a set of heavy doors at the end of the main hallway. This area is strictly off-limits, Mrs. Henderson explained, gesturing toward the old double doors with peeling blue paint. It's been closed for renovations since last spring. The building has structural issues, asbestos, faulty wiring, you name it. The board hasn't decided whether to renovate or demolish yet. I nodded, making a mental note. Do I need to check it during my rounds? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her clipboard. No need. Just make sure these doors remain locked. The janitors sometimes forget to secure them properly. Something in her tone made me uneasy, but I dismissed it. Every old building has its quirks and rumors. My shift started at 10 at night and ended at 6 in the morning. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I'd make my rounds through the modern wing, check the exterior doors, and occasionally catch up on paperback novels in the security office near the main entrance. It was during my fourth night when I first heard it, a sound so faint I initially thought I'd imagined it. A soft giggle, like a child trying to suppress laughter, emanating from behind the blue doors. I lowered my book, listening intently. The building settled back into silence, the only sound the gentle hum of the heating system. After a minute of nothing, I returned to my reading, chalking it up to the old pipes or my imagination working overtime in the quietness of night. But then it came again, not laughter this time, but the unmistakable patter of small footsteps running across a wooden floor. I set my book down and walked toward the blue doors, my flashlight gripped tightly in my sweating palm. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than usual, the fluorescent lights creating strange, elongated shadows that danced across the tiled floor. The doors loomed ahead, their peeling paint suddenly resembling claw marks in the dim light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than intended. "Is anyone there?" No response came, but as I pressed my ear against the crack between the doors, the footsteps abruptly stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant, as if something on the other side was listening just as intently as I was. I tried the handle, locked, as it should be. I fumbled with my key ring until I found the master key Mrs. Henderson had given me. "This opens every door in the building," she'd explained. "But remember, the old wing is off limits unless there's an emergency." Was this an emergency? Probably not. Most likely some animal had found its way inside, a raccoon or maybe a stray cat. Still, I needed to be sure. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been recently used. The mechanism turned with a heavy click that echoed down the empty hallway. Swallowing hard, I pushed one door open and shined my flashlight into the darkness beyond. The beam cut through thick dust, illuminating a corridor that hadn't seen use in months. Old classroom doors lined both sides, their small windows dark and reflective like vacant eyes. The air smelled musty and stale, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite identify, something sweet yet slightly metallic. "Security," I announced, stepping inside. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, overlapping with the faint drip of water from somewhere deeper in the building. "Anyone here?" The door creaked shut behind me with a soft thud that sent my heart racing. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the natural swing of an old door with aging hinges. I proceeded cautiously down the hallway, my flashlight revealing peeling wallpaper and forgotten bulletin boards still displaying children's artwork from the previous school year. A paper cutout of the sun had fallen halfway off the wall, its smiling face now appearing more like a grimace in the harsh beam of my light. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dust, small, child-sized indentations leading down the corridor and disappearing around a corner. I followed them slowly, each step seeming to make the temperature drop another degree. The footprints led to a classroom at the end of the hall. Room 108. The door was slightly ajar, a thin strip of darkness beckoning me inside. As I approached, I heard it again, the faint sound of a child's laughter, followed by what sounded like chalk scraping against a blackboard. I pushed the door open with the end of my flashlight, revealing an ordinary classroom frozen in time. Desks arranged in neat rows, a teacher's desk at the front, and a large chalkboard covering the wall. My beam caught something on the board that made my breath catch in my throat. Written in childish scrawl were the words, "Welcome back, Emorph Keller." I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. How could anyone know my name? The board should have been empty, the building had been closed for months. As I turned to leave, my light swept across the room one final time, and in that instant, I saw it, a small figure standing in the corner, partially hidden by shadows. It appeared to be a child, though I couldn't make out any features beyond a dark silhouette. "Hey," I called out, my voice breaking slightly. "You shouldn't be in here. It's not safe." The figure didn't move or respond. But as I took a step forward, it seemed to fade further into the shadows until it disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but an empty corner. I practically ran back to the blue doors, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the walls. Behind me, I could hear what sounded like multiple sets of footsteps, keeping pace just out of sight. The sweet metallic smell grew stronger, almost overpowering now. I burst through the doors back into the main hallway, slamming them shut and turning the key with trembling fingers. Leaning against the wall, I struggled to catch my breath as sweat cooled on my forehead. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or was my mind playing tricks, conjuring visions from shadows and dust? I wasn't sure, but one thing was certain, I wouldn't be venturing into the old wing again without a very good reason. As I walked back to the security office on unsteady legs, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And just before I turned the corner, I glanced back at the blue doors in time to see the handle turn slightly, as if someone, or something, was trying to get out. That night, I convinced myself it was all in my head. Old buildings make strange noises. Shadows play tricks in the dark. But as I drove home in the pale light of dawn, one question kept circling in my mind. How did whatever was in that classroom know my name? And why did it feel like it had been waiting for me? What drives a rational person to return to a place that terrified them? Curiosity? Stubbornness? Or perhaps the nagging suspicion that what they experienced wasn't entirely supernatural? After my encounter in the old wing, I couldn't stop thinking about the chalk message and the shadowy figure. Sleep eluded me during the day, my dreams invaded by giggling children and endless dark corridors. I considered quitting, but the thought of unemployment kept me from picking up the phone. Instead, I decided to learn more about the school's history. The next evening, I arrived an hour early for my shift and made my way to the administrative office. The school secretary, Martha Wilkins, was still there, organizing files before heading home. "Evening, Martha," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Mind if I ask you something about the old wing?" Martha glanced up, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and the air of someone who knew every secret the school had to offer. "What do you want to know about the dreadful place?" she asked, her fingers pausing over a stack of attendance records. "I heard some strange noises last night. Just wondering if there's any history I should be aware of." Martha's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Strange how?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound like I was losing my mind. "Like children playing. But that's impossible, right? The wing's been closed for months." She removed her glasses, folding them carefully before responding. "Bob, how much do you know about what happened here in 1986? "Nothing," I admitted. "I moved to town 5 years ago." Martha sighed, glancing at the clock as if weighing whether she had time for this conversation. Finally, she gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "In 1986, 3 children went missing from Oak Ridge. They were last seen staying late for detention in room 108. A chill ran through me as I remembered the classroom I'd entered the night before. "What happened to them?" I asked. "Nobody knows," Martha said, lowering her voice. "The teacher supervising detention, Mr. Davis, claimed the children had been picked up by their parents. But all 3 families insisted they never arrived home. The police investigation found nothing conclusive. The case remains unsolved." "And Mr. Davis?" "Resigned shortly after. Left town, I believe." Martha's lips formed a thin line. "Some people had theories, of course. Rumors spread that well, it doesn't matter now. What matters is that since then, people have reported strange occurrences in that part of the building. Laughter, footsteps, items moving on their own. The school board finally closed it last spring under the guise of renovations." "You don't believe it's actually being renovated?" Martha gave me a knowing look. "Have you seen any construction crews? Any blueprints or permits?" "No. They closed it because the incidents were increasing. The previous night watchman, Thomas Garvey, quit without notice after only 2 weeks. Claimed he saw things no one would believe." My mouth went dry. "Did he mention writing on chalkboards?" Martha stared at me for a long moment. "No, but Miss Edwards, the art teacher, found childish drawings appearing on her board overnight. Drawings of 3 children holding hands with a tall, dark figure." Before I could respond, the phone rang. Martha answered it, and from her side of the conversation, it was clearly an urgent parent matter. She gestured apologetically that our talk would have to end. As I left the office, I couldn't shake the connection between what Martha had told me and what I'd experienced. Room 108. 3 missing children. strange phenomena that had been occurring for decades. My shift that night felt different. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound amplified. I deliberately avoided the blue doors during my first few rounds, taking the long way around the modern wing. But the thought of what might be happening behind those doors gnawed at me. What if there was someone, or something, trying to communicate? Just after 2 in the morning, during a lull when the building was at its quietest, I found myself standing before the blue doors again. No sounds came from the other side, but the air felt charged, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. I took out my phone and searched for information about the missing children. Several old news articles appeared, detailing the disappearance of 3 fifth graders, Michael Thornton, Emily Watson, and Daniel Keller. Keller. The same as my last name. Coincidence, I told myself. Keller isn't an uncommon name. But doubt crept in, alongside a growing sense that I was being pulled into something I didn't fully understand. I put away my phone and unlocked the doors with slightly steadier hands than the night before. This time, I was prepared. I'd brought extra batteries for my flashlight, and I'd even stopped by a hardware store to purchase an electromagnetic field detector, a device paranormal investigators supposedly use to detect spiritual presences. I felt slightly ridiculous bringing it, but it offered a small comfort. The old wing was just as I'd left it, dark, dusty, and eerily silent. I moved more deliberately this time, sweeping my light methodically across the hallway. The EMF detector remained quiet in my other hand. When I reached room 108, I paused outside the door. No chalk sounds, no laughter. Just the hollow emptiness of an abandoned building. I pushed the door open and pointed my flashlight at the chalkboard. It was clean, no welcome message, no writing of any kind. Had I imagined it the night before? I stepped inside, scanning every corner of the room with my light. No shadowy figures, no footprints besides my own from the previous night. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by doubt. Was my mind playing tricks? Had stress and the power of suggestion caused me to see things that weren't there? I was about to leave when the EMF detector suddenly sprang to life, its lights flashing from green to red as it emitted a high-pitched whine. I nearly dropped it in surprise, watching as the readings spiked off the charts. "Hello?" I called out, turning in a slow circle. "Is someone here?" The temperature plummeted so rapidly I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. The detector continued to scream, its lights flickering frantically. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it went silent. The room returned to its normal temperature, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Until I turned back toward the door and saw them, 3 children standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. 2 boys and a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, dressed in outdated clothes that seemed to belong to the 1980s. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under their eyes. I stumbled backward, knocking into a student desk that scraped loudly across the floor. Who are you?" I managed to ask, though part of me already knew the answer. None of them spoke. Instead, the girl, Emily, I presumed, pointed toward the teacher's desk at the front of the room. My flashlight beam followed her gesture, revealing a dusty drawer that was partially open. Against my better judgment, I approached the desk, keeping my eyes on the children who remained motionless in the doorway. With trembling fingers, I pulled the drawer open further. Inside lay a single item, a faded black and white photograph. I picked it up, tilting it toward the light. It showed a class of children with their teacher, the back labeled Oak Ridge Elementary, 108, 1986. I scanned the young faces until I found the 3 children now standing in the doorway. They looked different in the photo, vibrant, alive, with bright smiles instead of the solemn expressions they wore now. Standing behind them was their teacher, Mr. Davis. Something about his face made my skin crawl, not because it was frightening, but because it was familiar. I'd seen it before in old family photographs. He looked exactly like my father. My father, who had moved our family across the country suddenly in the late 80s. My father, who never talked about his time as a teacher. My father, who had inexplicable nightmares that left him screaming in the dark. "That's not possible," I whispered, looking up from the photograph. The children were gone. In their place stood a tall, dark figure that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. Though it had no discernible features, I sensed it watching me, sizing me up. The air grew thick with that sweet metallic smell, so strong now I could taste it at the back of my throat. I dropped the photograph and ran, shoving past the figure that felt solid yet impossibly cold. The hallway seemed to stretch and distort as I fled, the distance to the blue doors expanding with each step. Behind me, rapid footsteps followed, not the light patter of children, but heavy, deliberate strides. Something grabbed at my jacket, catching the fabric for a moment before I tore free. I hit the blue doors at full speed, bursting through into the main hallway and collapsing against the opposite wall, gasping for breath. This time, I didn't stop to lock the doors. I ran straight to the security office, where I remained for the rest of my shift, jumping at every creak and groan of the building. When morning finally came, I sat in my car, unable to start the engine. The photograph kept replaying in my mind, the children, the teacher, the impossible connection to my own past. Could my father really have been Mr. Davis? Could he somehow be connected to those missing children? I needed answers, but I was afraid of what I might discover. One thing was certain, whatever haunted the old wing of Oak Ridge Elementary wasn't merely a collection of restless spirits. It was something personal, something that had been waiting specifically for me. And I had a sinking feeling that I wouldn't be able to escape it simply by quitting my job. The blue doors might contain it for now, but for how long? And what would happen when whatever lurked behind them finally found its way out? With trembling hands, I started the car and drove home, the rising sun doing little to dispel the darkness that had taken root inside me. Tonight, I would have to return. Not because I wanted to, but because I sensed the children, or whatever they had become, wouldn't give me a choice. Have you ever felt the weight of the past pressing down on you, moments from your history suddenly connecting to form a picture you never wanted to see? I spent the day in a state of agitated research, digging through old family albums I'd inherited after my father's death 3 years ago. I'd never paid much attention to them before. My relationship with my father had been strained at best. Now I scrutinized every photograph, looking for confirmation of what I'd seen in that classroom. In the back of a dusty album, I found a staff photo from Oak Ridge Elementary dated 1985. And there he was, younger but unmistakable, James Keller, 5th grade teacher. My father. My hands shook as I stared at his smiling face. Had he been involved in the disappearance of those children? Was that why we moved so abruptly when I was just 4 years old? The timing matched up perfectly. I called my mother, careful to keep my questions casual. "Mom, did Dad ever teach at an elementary school in Iowa before we moved to Oregon?" Her pause lasted a beat too long. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious." I found an old photo while cleaning up. Another pause. "Yes, he taught at a school called Oak Ridge for a few years. It didn't end well. He never liked talking about it." "What happened?" "Robert, some things are better left in the past," she said firmly. "Your father had his demons, but he was a good man in his own way." She changed the subject after that, and I didn't push. Her evasiveness told me enough. There was something to hide, something significant enough that even decades later, she was reluctant to discuss it. By the time I arrived for my shift that night, I was exhausted but wound tight with nervous energy. The school seemed to watch me as I walked toward the entrance, its windows like dark, judging eyes. Inside, the normally comforting hum of the heating system now sounded like distant whispering. Martha was gone for the day, but she'd left a sealed envelope on my desk with my name scrawled across it. Inside was a newspaper clipping yellowed with age and a brief note, "Thought you should see this. Be careful tonight." The clipping was from the local paper dated September 4th, 1986, just a week after the children went missing. The headline read, "Search continues for missing Oak Ridge students, teacher questioned." The article detailed how James Keller, the detention supervisor that fateful afternoon, had been questioned multiple times by police. It mentioned inconsistencies in his account and suspicious behavior in the days following the disappearance. Though never formally charged, he resigned his position and left town shortly after. The piece ended with a quote from Daniel Keller's mother, "My paternal aunt, I realized with a shock, my brother would never hurt a child. This town is destroying an innocent man's life while the real perpetrator walks free." My father had been the prime suspect in the disappearance of his own nephew and 2 other children. And now, decades later, I was working nights in the very building where it happened. This couldn't be coincidence. I felt it in my bones. I had been drawn here for a reason. The children, if that's truly what they were, had been waiting for me specifically. The first half of my shift passed in a haze of distracted patrols. Every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed to conceal a watching figure. I deliberately avoided the blue doors, taking circuitous routes through the modern wing. But as midnight approached, I felt an increasingly powerful pull toward the old building. By 1 a.m, I could no longer resist. Standing before the blue doors, I listened intently. No sounds came from the other side, but something told me I was expected. This time when I entered, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt charged, alive with anticipation. My flashlight beam seemed dimmer than before, struggling to penetrate the darkness that seemed thicker, almost tangible. "I know who you are," I called out, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Michael, Emily, Daniel. I know what happened to you." Did I really know? No, but I had theories. Dark suspicions about my father's involvement that made me sick to contemplate. The response was immediate, 3 separate giggles echoing from different directions, surrounding me. The sweet metallic smell returned, stronger than ever. I recognized it now. Copper. Blood. I moved forward, drawn toward room 108 as if pulled by an invisible thread. The door stood open, darkness spilling out like ink. Before I could reach it, the lights in the hallway flickered to life, ancient fluorescents buzzing and popping as they illuminated the corridor. Impossible. The power to this wing had been disconnected months ago. Yet there they were, harsh lights revealing peeling paint and water-stained ceiling tiles. And now, clearly visible against the faded linoleum, were smears of what looked like fresh blood, forming a trail leading to the classroom. My rational mind screamed at me to turn back, to call the police, to run as far and as fast as I could. But something stronger compelled me forward, step by reluctant step. Room 108 was transformed. While the hallway appeared decrepit and abandoned, The classroom looked as it might have in 1986, clean, organized, with colorful educational posters on the walls and fresh chalk in the tray beneath the blackboard. 3 desks in the front row had names taped to them: Michael, Emily, Daniel. And behind the teacher's desk sat a man, his head bent over a stack of papers. My father. He looked up as I entered, adjusting his glasses with a familiar gesture that sent chills down my spine. He appeared exactly as he had in the staff photo, mid-30s, dark hair neatly combed, wearing a button-down shirt and tie. "You're late for detention," he said, his voice chillingly familiar yet somehow wrong, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. I gripped my flashlight tighter, though the room was already well lit. "You're not real," I managed to say. "My father is dead." He smiled, and in that moment, his face seemed to shift, becoming something less than human, the skin too tight over the bones, the eyes too dark and empty. "We're all dead here, Robert," he replied. "Even you, in a way. Part of you died when you learned the truth about your family, didn't it?" From the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. The 3 children had appeared, sitting silently at their designated desks. Their forms flickered like bad television reception, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes transparent. "What happened to them?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Why don't you ask them yourself?" my father's doppelganger suggested, gesturing toward the children. I turned toward them fully. "What happened to you?" The children spoke in unison, their voices overlapping in an unsettling chorus. He didn't want us to tell. About the touching. About the photos. About the pain. My stomach lurched. The implications were horrific. "So he heard us," Emily continued alone, her voice small yet somehow filling the room. "In the supply closet." She pointed to a door at the back of the classroom that I hadn't noticed before. "He said we'd go home afterward," Michael added. "But we never left this room." Daniel, my cousin, stared at me with hollow eyes. "Your father took us one by one into that closet. Only he came out." I shook my head, unwilling to accept it. "No. There would have been evidence. Bodies." "The school was being renovated that summer," not my father explained calmly, as if discussing the weather. "New concrete was poured in the foundation the very next day. Convenient timing." The room began to distort, the walls seeming to pulse and breathe. The lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness before returning brighter than before. Each flash revealed the children in various states of injury, bruised, bloody, broken. "You're the last killer," Daniel said, his voice suddenly right beside my ear though he remained seated at his desk. "You can end this. Set us free." "How?" I asked, backing toward the door. My hand found the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Locked. The knob my father stood, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Blood calls to blood. Sin passes to son. The debt must be paid. The temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of my face as the apparition of my father approached, his form growing taller, darker, more abstract with each step. The children began to cry, their sobs building to a cacophony that made my ears ache. "I'm not responsible for what he did," I shouted over the noise. "I was just a child myself." "But you suspected," Emily accused, suddenly standing beside not my father. "All those nightmares he had. The way he'd never talk about his teaching days. The newspaper clippings your mother hid in the attic that you found when you were 15. You knew something wasn't right, but you said nothing. She was right. I'd found articles about the missing children years ago, noted my father's name mentioned as their teacher, but I convinced myself it was coincidence. I'd never connected the dots because I hadn't wanted to. The walls began to bleed, dark red liquid seeping from the seams where they met the ceiling. The metallic smell became overwhelming. Not my father continued his approach, his face now a blank void, his hands elongating into grotesque claws. "You have his blood," Michael said, appearing on my other side. "You bear his name. You benefit from his freedom. He lived 30 more years because no one found us. The debt must be paid," they chanted together. "The debt must be paid." The classroom began to transform, the cheerful educational environment giving way to its true, decayed state. But worse than the peeling paint and broken furniture was what appeared on the walls, dozens of Polaroid photographs, each showing a child in various states of undress, fear evident in their eyes. Trophy photos from a predator's collection. Among them were pictures of Michael, Emily, and Daniel. And others. So many others. "He didn't stop with us," Daniel whispered. "He just got more careful." Horror washed over me. Had my father continued his crimes after we moved? Were there other victims buried in other towns? The implications were too terrible to contemplate. Not my father lunged suddenly, his form now a towering shadow that blotted out the lights. I dodged, slamming into a desk that shattered beneath me as if made of balsa wood. Sharp pain lanced through my side where a splintered piece jabbed between my ribs. The children watched impassively as I struggled to my feet, blood seeping through my uniform shirt. Their eyes reflected no light, black pools and pale faces. "We can't leave until it's finished," Emily said. "Until the truth is known and the guilty are punished." "I'm not guilty," I protested, though doubt gnawed at me. Had I really been as innocent as I believed? Could I have done something, said something, that might have saved other children from my father's predation? "Then prove it," the shadow that had been my father hissed, its voice now a distorted growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Open the closet. Face what you did. Acknowledge the truth." The supply closet door swung open of its own accord, revealing impenetrable darkness beyond. Even my flashlight beam couldn't penetrate it, as if the darkness was a solid, living thing. I knew with absolute certainty that if I entered that closet, I would never leave this building alive. Whatever waited in that small space wasn't just the spirits of 3 murdered children, it was something older, something that had perhaps used their tragedy as a doorway into our world. Yet I felt compelled to move toward it, each step feeling like my last chance at redemption. For my father's sins. For my own willful blindness. "Blood calls to blood," the shadow crooned. "Sin passes to son." As I reached the threshold of the closet, the darkness within seemed to reach out toward me, tendrils of black mist curling around my ankles. The children gathered behind me, their cold hands pressing against my back, urging me forward. "Wait," I gasped, an idea forming. "If I do this, if I acknowledge the truth, you'll be free?" "The truth is what matters." "Truth and justice," Daniel corrected. "One without the other is meaningless." "Then there's another way," I said, turning to face them. "A better way to honor your memory than adding another death." The shadow loomed over us all, its darkness spreading across the ceiling. "There is no escape from this room," it growled. "Not for any Keller." But I had seen something, the faintest hesitation in the children's eyes when I mentioned honoring their memory. Whatever had happened in this room, whatever evil had taken root here, these were still the spirits of children who had once been innocent, who deserve justice more than vengeance. Help me tell your story, I pleaded. Let me expose what you did. Let me find your bodies so you can have proper burials. Let me bring your families closure. For a long moment, the room was absolutely silent. Then Emily stepped forward, her form becoming more solid, more human. You would do this? Destroy your father's memory? Bring shame to your family name? My father destroyed himself when he hurt you, I said firmly. And the Keller name means nothing compared to your lives. The shadow shrieked, a sound so terrible I fell to my knees, hands clapped over my ears. The walls shook, dust and plaster raining from the ceiling. The photographs burst into flame one by one, curling and blackening as they were consumed. Liar, it howled. You are his blood. You cannot escape your nature. But something was changing. The children stood straighter, their expressions clearing as if awakening from a long nightmare. The oppressive feeling in the room began to lift. We accept your offer, Michael said, his voice stronger, clearer. Find us. Tell our story. Bring him to justice, even in death. The shadow thrashed wildly, its form deteriorating as the children's became more defined. It lunged at me one last time, claws raking across my chest. Pain exploded through me, hot and sharp. Then darkness claimed me completely. I awoke to fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. My chest and side were heavily bandaged, and 4 drip feeding into my arm. A police officer dozed in a chair by the door. According to the doctors, I'd been found unconscious in room 108 by the morning custodian, suffering from multiple lacerations and significant blood loss. They attributed my injuries to a fall through rotted floorboards and subsequent panic attack. I knew better. But how could I explain what had really happened? Who would believe me? As I recovered in the hospital bed, I made a decision. I would keep my promise to those children, whatever the cost. I would find their remains, expose my father's crimes, and finally allow Michael, Emily, and Daniel to rest. Even if it meant destroying what remained of my family in the process. The officer stirred, noticed I was awake, and approached my bed. Mr. Keller? I'm Detective Ramirez. We have some questions about what you were doing in the condemned wing of the school. I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my chest. Detective, I have information about 3 children who went missing in 1986. And I know where to find their bodies. Did you know that secrets have weight? That they can press down on a place until the very air feels heavy with concealment? Detective Ramirez didn't believe me at first. Who would? A night watchman claiming to know the location of bodies missing for nearly 40 years, based on visions from ghosts. It sounded like the ravings of a man suffering from blood loss and trauma. Mr. Keller, he said, closing his notebook after taking my statement, we appreciate your concern for this cold case, but without concrete evidence, I can't justify tearing up the foundation of a public school. Check the records, I insisted, struggling to sit up against the pain in my chest. Verify that renovations were done in room 108 storage closet right after the disappearances. Check if my father was questioned. It's all there. Ramirez's expression softened slightly. I'll look into it. But I need you to understand, even if your father was a suspect, that doesn't mean we can start demolishing school property on a hunch. I lay back against the pillows, exhausted but determined. There, detective. Under the concrete in that closet. I know it with absolute certainty. He left with a non-committal nod, clearly humoring the injured man rather than taking me seriously. But I didn't need him to believe me immediately. I just needed him to look, to examine the records, to find enough circumstantial evidence to justify a search. I was discharged from the hospital 3 days later with strict instructions to rest. Instead, I went directly to the public library to search through microfiche archives of the local newspaper. I found dozens of articles about the disappearances, the search efforts, the gradual loss of hope. And buried in a small article dated September 10, 1986, was the confirmation I needed. Renovations continue at Oak Ridge Elementary despite recent tragedy. Principal Norman Turner states that planned maintenance of several classrooms in the East Wing, including plumbing repairs requiring concrete work, will proceed as scheduled. I photocopied the article and dropped it off at the police station with a note for Detective Ramirez. Then I drove past the school, drawn to it like a moth to flame. Yellow police tape now surrounded the blue doors, marking the old wing as an active investigation scene. Not a full excavation yet, but a start. That night, for the first time since my encounter in room 108, I slept without nightmares. No ghostly children invaded my dreams, no shadowy figure of my father loomed over me. I woke feeling almost peaceful, as if taking the first steps toward exposing the truth had lightened some invisible burden. The phone rang as I was making coffee. Detective Ramirez. We've reviewed the historical records, he said without preamble. There was indeed concrete work done in that wing immediately after the disappearances. We've obtained a warrant to investigate further. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he warned. This is still very preliminary. And I have to ask, how exactly did you come across this information? You've only been in town a few months, working at that school for less than 2 weeks. I hesitated. The truth would sound insane, but lying to police never ended well. I had experiences in that building. Things I can't rationally explain. And I found out recently that my father was James Keller, the teacher who was suspected back then. A long silence followed. You're saying you're related to a suspect in the original case, and you just happened to take a job at the same school where the children disappeared? I didn't know I applied, I said quickly. I only made the connection after what happened in room 108. Mr. Keller, I'll be frank. This raises serious concerns. If we do find evidence confirming your claim, you understand you'll be subject to intense scrutiny. Some might even suspect your involvement, despite the timeline making that impossible. I understand. I just want the truth to come out. Those children deserve justice, even after all this time. Another pause. We're bringing in ground-penetrating radar tomorrow morning. You should prepare yourself for either outcome. We might find nothing, or we might find exactly what you described. Both possibilities carry their own consequences. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee as it grew cold. I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped, something that would irrevocably change my life and the legacy of my family name. Yet I felt no regret, only a grim determination to see it through. That afternoon, my doorbell rang. A woman in her 60s stood on my porch, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "Are you Robert Keller?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. I nodded, immediately on guard. "Can I help you?" "I'm Margaret Thornton." Michael was my son. My heart dropped. One of the mothers of the missing children, standing on my doorstep 40 years after losing her child. "Mrs. Thornton, May I come in?" she interrupted. Detective Ramirez told me what you claimed. About knowing where they are. I stepped aside silently, letting her enter. We sat in my living room, the air heavy with unspoken grief. I never gave up, she said simply. All these years, I kept hoping for answers. The others, Emily's parents, Daniel's mother, they moved away, tried to rebuild their lives. But I stayed, waiting. I'm so sorry, I managed, the words feeling woefully inadequate. She studied me carefully. You look like him. Your father. He was so charming, so good with the children. No one wanted to believe he could be capable of what they suspected. The resemblance to my father had always been a point of pride. Now it felt like a curse, a physical manifestation of sin etched into my features. I didn't know, I said, about any of it. Not until recently. And now you say you know where our children are buried. How? After all this time, how could you possibly know? I couldn't tell her about the ghostly visitations, the supernatural revelations. It would sound cruel, exploitative of her grief. Research, I said instead. Connections I made based on timing and circumstances. It's circumstantial, but you're certain enough to tell the police to dig up concrete that hasn't been disturbed in 40 years, she finished. Certain enough to risk reviving the worst pain imaginable for the families involved. Put that way, my actions seemed almost callous. I only want the truth to come out, I said softly. For Michael, and Emily, and Daniel. Mrs. Thornton's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Do you know what it's like? To live 4 decades not knowing if your child is alive or dead? To jump every time the phone rings, wondering if this is finally news? To see children who would be the same age as your missing son and wonder if one of them might be him, somehow, somewhere? I shook my head, humbled by the enormity of her grief. If you're right, she continued, it means I've been waiting 40 years for a miracle that was never going to happen. That Michael has been beneath that school all along, while I've been living just 6 blocks away. Her voice finally broke. I don't know whether to thank you or hate you for that. You can hate me, I said honestly. I understand. She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. I don't hate you. I'm just afraid. Afraid of finally knowing the truth and afraid of being disappointed again if you're wrong. She stood, straightening her blouse with dignity. They're digging tomorrow? Yes. Ground-penetrating radar first, then excavation if needed. I'll be there, she said with quiet determination. After 40 years of waiting, I need to see it with my own eyes. After she left, I sat motionless, the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. What if I was wrong? What if the children's spirits had somehow misled me, or if I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen? The pain I would cause these families who had already suffered so much would be unforgivable. But the alternative, leaving those children forgotten beneath concrete, their murderer unpunished even in death, was equally unthinkable. Sleep eluded me that night. I paced my small apartment, replaying every moment of my supernatural encounters, searching for any inconsistency, any reason to doubt what I'd been shown. But the conviction remained unshakable. They were there, beneath the storage closet floor in room 108. Dawn found me bleary-eyed but resolved. I drove to Oak Ridge Elementary, arriving just as police vehicles and an unmarked van with forensic services printed on the side pulled into the parking lot. A small crowd had already gathered, school officials, police officers, and 3 elderly people who stood slightly apart, holding hands, the parents of the missing children. Detective Ramirez nodded grimly as I approached. We're about to begin. Are you sure you want to be here for this? I need to be, I replied. We followed the forensic team through the blue doors and down the hallway that had become so familiar to me. Room 108 looked different in daylight, smaller, sadder, the decay more evident. The storage closet door stood open, revealing a small space about 6 feet square with bare concrete flooring. The technicians set up their equipment, running the ground-penetrating radar over the surface in a careful grid pattern. The machine hummed softly, the only sound in a tense silence. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the lead technician looked up from his monitor, his expression grave. There's something here, he said quietly. Anomalies consistent with remains. 3 distinct shapes, approximately 3 to 4 feet below the surface. A collective gasp swept through the room. Mrs. Thornton swayed slightly, supported by Daniel's mother, whose face had gone chalk white. Ramirez turned to me, his expression unreadable. You were right. What followed was a blur of activity. The school was fully evacuated and closed. Additional police and forensic teams arrived. The concrete was carefully marked and photographed before the jackhammers started their grim work. I watched from the hallway, unable to witness the actual excavation. The parents had been escorted to a private room where victim advocates could support them through the process. Hours passed, the sound of drilling and digging occasionally punctuated by hushed voices and the click of camera shutters. Finally, Detective Ramirez emerged from the classroom, his face ashen. He pulled off his latex gloves with deliberate motions, as if needing something mundane to focus on. 3 sets of remains, he confirmed quietly. Children, based on size. Exactly where you said they would be. Though I'd known, had been absolutely certain, hearing it confirmed still hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against the wall, trying to process the grim reality. What happens now? I asked. Forensic anthropologists will excavate and document everything. DNA testing to confirm identities. And a full investigation into your father, posthumously. I nodded numbly. The families? Being informed now. It's difficult, but there's some relief in finally knowing. He studied me carefully. You understand this isn't over, right? There will be questions, endless questions, about how you knew, about your father's activities after leaving town, about potential other victims. I know. I'll cooperate however I can. As the day wore on, the school grounds transformed into a full crime scene. News vans gathered outside the police perimeter. My name hadn't been released yet, but it would be soon enough. The son of a murderer who exposed his father's crimes 40 years later, the story was too sensational to stay private. Evening fell, casting long shadows through the hallways of Oak Ridge Elementary. I remained on site, answering questions, providing details about my father's life after Iowa. No one had asked me to leave, and I couldn't have gone even if they had. I felt bound to this place, to the completion of what I'd started. As the forensic team took a break, I found myself alone in the hallway outside room 108. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a pressure had been released. The sweet metallic smell was gone, replaced by the mundane odors of dust and concrete. We found them, I whispered, unsure if the children's spirits could still hear me. You can rest now. No ghostly laughter answered me, no ethereal footsteps echoed down the corridor. But for just a moment, I thought I saw them, 3 small figures standing at the end of the hallway, holding hands. Their outlines were fuzzy, indistinct, but there was a brightness to them that hadn't been there before. Emily raised her hand in what might have been a wave. Michael nodded solemnly. And Daniel, my cousin I'd never known, smiled faintly before all three turned and faded into the shadows. Is someone there? Called a technician, emerging from a side room. Just me, I replied, looking at the now empty hallway. Just saying goodbye. Later that night, as I finally returned to my apartment, my phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? I answered wearily. Robert? It was my mother's voice, trembling with emotion. I just saw the news. About what they found at that school. I sank onto my couch, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Mom, I need to know, she interrupted, her voice breaking. Did you really find them? The missing children? Yes. They were exactly where I said they would be. A strangled sob came through the line. Then it's true. What I always feared. What I tried so hard not to believe. You knew? I asked, a new horror dawning. All this time, you knew what he'd done? No, she protested. Not for certain. But there were signs. Things I ignored because I couldn't face them. The nightmares. The way he'd react if anyone mentioned Iowa or his teaching days. A box in the garage I found once, with photographs I destroyed without really looking at them. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself from the truth. The revelation should have angered me, that she'd suspected but remained silent, that she'd chosen to shield my father rather than his victims. But I felt only a profound sadness for the weight she carried all these years, for the willful blindness that had become its own kind of prison. It's over now, I said quietly. The truth is out. What happens next? She asked, sounding suddenly old and afraid. I don't know. But whatever comes, we'll face it. No more secrets, no more looking away. After we hung up, I stood by my window, watching the night sky. For the first time since entering room 108, I felt no presence watching me, no eyes following my movements. The connection had been severed, the debt, if not paid, at least acknowledged. But as I turned away from the window, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a tall, dark figure standing in the corner of my living room. Not the children this time, but the shadow that had worn my father's face. It remained for just a second before dissolving into the darkness, but its message was clear. Some sins leave impressions that cannot be erased by a single act of truth. Some debts require more than acknowledgement to be truly settled. And I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that my involvement with the tragedy at Oak Ridge Elementary was far from over. Is it possible to inherit evil? Does it seep into the bloodline like a genetic disease, dormant until triggered by circumstance? Or is it merely proximity that corrupts, the subtle influence of witnessing darkness normalized day after day? These questions haunted me in the weeks following the discovery at Oak Ridge Elementary. The case became national news. Son exposes father's 40-year-old triple murder. My name and face were everywhere, my privacy shattered. Some hailed me as a hero who brought closure to grieving families. Others viewed me with suspicion, unable to believe I hadn't known the truth sooner. The forensic evidence was damning. The children had been buried in the same clothes they'd worn to school that final day, their bodies wrapped in plastic sheeting, a layer of lies sprinkled between them and the concrete to accelerate decomposition. Despite these efforts, enough remained for DNA confirmation. Michael Thornton, Emily Watson, and Daniel Keller had indeed been found exactly where I'd said they would be. My father's photograph appeared alongside mine in news stories, our resemblance unsettling even to me now. Authorities began investigating cold cases in every town we'd lived after leaving Iowa, searching for patterns for other missing children. My childhood transformed in retrospect, every memory now potentially tainted, every kindness my father had shown me now suspect. Had the camping trips been genuine father-son bonding, or opportunities for him to scout remote locations? Had the basement workshop been simply a hobby space, or something more sinister? I cooperated fully with investigators, though I never revealed the true source of my knowledge about the body's location. Instead, I claimed to have found old documents among my father's belongings, references that had led me to make the connection. It wasn't entirely false. I had found those newspaper clippings years ago. I just needed supernatural intervention to understand their significance. The funerals were held on a crisp autumn day, 3 small caskets finally laid to rest in proper graves after 4 decades in their concrete prison. I attended at the family's invitation, standing at a respectful distance as prayers were said and tears flowed freely. Mrs. Thornton nodded to me once, a gesture of acknowledgement if not forgiveness. It was more than I deserved. That night, I returned to my apartment exhausted beyond words. The emotional toll of the past weeks had left me hollow, disconnected from normal life. I hadn't returned to my job at the school, couldn't imagine ever walking those halls again, and my savings were dwindling rapidly. Soon I need to decide whether to stay in this town that now associated my face with unspeakable tragedy or start over. Sleep eluded me, as it had most nights since the discovery. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, watching the empty street below. The ghost of Michael Thornton hadn't appeared since that fateful night he led me to the truth. Perhaps his soul had finally found peace, or perhaps he couldn't bear to face me now that I knew everything. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, another message from Dr. Layton, the forensic psychologist who'd been pursuing me for an interview. She wanted to study me, to understand what it was like to be the child of a monster. How could I explain to her that this question consumed me too? 3 days later, I found myself in a realtor's office, signing papers to sell my father's house. No one would want to live there now, but a developer had made an offer to tear it down and build something new. I accepted far below market value, desperate to be free of it. The realtor avoided eye contact throughout our transaction. As I handed over the keys, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, exactly, but a lessening of weight. I thought of what Mrs. Thornton had said at the funeral reception, her voice steady despite decades of grief. Evil isn't inherited, Mr. Foster. It's chosen, day after day. I wanted desperately to believe her. Yet something dark lingered in my mind, the memory of childish rage when Bobby Winters had broken my science project in 4th grade, the violent thoughts that had flashed through my mind but never materialized into action. Had my father felt similar impulses? Had he simply lacked whatever internal barrier had stopped me from acting on mine? The inheritance question haunted me as I drove west, my possessions packed in the trunk, no destination in mind except away. I checked into a motel that night in a town whose name I didn't bother to remember. As I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at water stains on the ceiling, I made a decision. I would spend my life studying the nature of evil, not as Dr. Layton wanted to study me, like a specimen under glass, but as a participant in the human struggle against darkness. I would return to school, pursue psychology or criminology, learn what separated monsters from men. If evil could be inherited, perhaps it could also be contained, understood, even defeated. In the morning, I woke to find a small origami crane on the nightstand beside me. I hadn't made it. No one had been in my room. I picked it up with trembling fingers, recognizing the paper, a page from one of those old newspaper clippings about the missing children. Michael Thornton wasn't finished with me yet. And perhaps, neither was my journey to understand the darkness that had shaped my life. I folded the paper crane carefully into my wallet. Whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. What happens when the wilderness decides it wants something from you? The question had been nagging at me since we first stepped into the dense northern Maine forest 3 days ago. I'm not usually the superstitious type. I'm Alex, the logical one, the engineer who needs evidence before believing in anything. But there was something about these woods that made my skin crawl from the moment we crossed that invisible boundary between civilization and wilderness. Our group consisted of 5 friends: myself, Mike, my college roommate and trip organizer, Rachel, his girlfriend, Ethan, our wildlife photographer friend, and Jess, my childhood friend who needed to disconnect after a recent breakup. We planned this trip for months, a 7-day backpacking adventure through one of the most remote sections of Maine's vast northern forests. "Did you guys hear that?" Rachel whispered, freezing in place as we set up camp on our 3rd evening. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple between the towering pines. "Hear what?" Mike asked, hammering a tent stake into the ground. "I don't know, like a voice or something." Rachel's eyes darted between the trees surrounding our small clearing. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said without looking up from his camera where he was reviewing the day's photos. "These old forests make all kinds of sounds." I should have paid more attention to Rachel's concern. I should have noticed how the birds had stopped singing an hour earlier than usual. I should have questioned why the squirrels and chipmunks we'd seen all day had suddenly vanished. But I didn't. As darkness fell, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and passing around a flask of whiskey. The flames cast dancing shadows across our faces, momentarily transforming familiar features into grotesque masks before returning them to normal. "You know, the indigenous people of this region believed these forests were inhabited by spirits," Jess said, her voice taking on that storytelling quality I remembered from our childhood sleepovers. "What kind of spirits?" Mike asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Wendigo," she replied, her eyes wide. "Creatures that were once human but transformed after resorting to cannibalism during harsh winters. They're said to possess people, driving them to insanity and hunger for human flesh." "That's just a story to keep kids from wandering off," Ethan scoffed, but I noticed how his eyes flicked nervously toward the darkness beyond our fire's light. "Every story has its origin," Jess countered. "These forests are old. Older than any of us can comprehend. Who knows what secrets they keep?" A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and we all fell silent, our heads turning in unison toward the sound. "Probably just a deer," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. That night, I couldn't sleep. The nylon walls of my tent seemed impossibly thin, a meaningless barrier between me and whatever waited in the darkness. The wind picked up around midnight, rustling through the trees with a sound that resembled whispers. Human whispers. "It's just pareidolia," I told myself. The human brain is wired to find patterns, to hear voices in random noise. It's nothing. But when the whispers seemed to form my name, Ali, drawn out and distorted like someone speaking through water, rational explanations became harder to cling to. I checked my watch, 3:27 in the morning. Outside, the moon had risen, casting silver light through the canopy and creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted and moved even when the wind was still. A sound cut through the night, not a whisper this time, but a low, mournful howl that raised the hair on my arms. It wasn't a wolf. I'd heard wolves before. This sound carried notes that were almost human, like someone trying to imitate a wolf but unable to disguise their human vocal cords. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking. "Did you guys hear that?" I called out, my voice sounding small and vulnerable in the vastness of the forest. No response came from the other tents. The howl came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling our campsite. "Mike? Ethan?" I called, louder this time. "Rachel? Jess?" The footsteps stopped. My breath caught in my throat as a shadow passed across the wall of my tent, tall and humanoid but moving with an unnatural, jerking gait. I forced myself to unzip the tent, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, empty except for our 4 tents. Wait. 4 tents? I counted again. My tent, Mike and Rachel's larger tent, Ethan's tent, and where was Jess's tent? "Jess?" I called, my voice cracking. "Jess?" I stumbled to the spot where her tent had been set up just hours before. All that remained was a small depression in the grass and her backpack, sitting upright as if she placed it there before. Before what? As I stood frozen in disbelief, that howl came again from somewhere deep in the forest, but this time, beneath the animal quality, I could recognize something familiar. It was Jess's voice. How does someone's entire tent just disappear? Mike demanded, running his hands through his disheveled hair as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. We'd spent the remaining hours of darkness huddled together in Mike and Rachel's tent, too terrified to search the woods at night, but too afraid to sleep. "I'm telling you, I heard something circling the camp," I insisted, my voice hoarse from calling Jess's name throughout the night. "And then that howling, it sounded like her." Rachel sat on a fallen log, Jess's backpack clutched in her lap like a lifeline. "Her sleeping bag is still inside her pack," she said quietly. "So are her clothes and water bottle. Who goes anywhere in the wilderness without these things?" Ethan returned from scouting the perimeter of our campsite, his camera hanging and used around his neck. "There are tracks," he said, his face pale. "But they don't make any sense." We followed him to the edge of the clearing where the forest grew dense. In the soft earth, we could see footprints, human-sized and barefoot, leading away from where Jess's tent had been. But after about 20 feet, the tracks changed. The stride lengthened impossibly, and the impression deepened as if the person had suddenly become much heavier. And then, strangest of all, the human footprints gradually morphed into something animal-like, elongated with what looked like claw marks at the tips. "This isn't possible," Mike whispered, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. "Something dragged her tent away," Ethan said, pointing to a wide, smooth depression in the undergrowth. "But there's only one set of footprints leading away. Nothing coming in." A sick feeling settled in my stomach. "We need to find her. Now." We gathered essential supplies, water, energy bars, first aid kit, flashlights, and I insisted we each carry a knife or walking stick that could double as a weapon. None of us voiced what we were all thinking, that we might already be too late. Following the trail was simultaneously the only thing we could do and the last thing any of us wanted. The forest, which had seemed merely wild yesterday, now felt actively malevolent. The trees grew closer together the deeper we went, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more sunlight until we were walking in a perpetual twilight despite it being mid-morning. "We should mark our path," Rachel suggested, pulling out a roll of bright orange surveyor's tape from her pack. "Tie pieces to branches so we can find our way back." We moved slowly, following the bizarre tracks and the drag marks from the tent. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Fallen trees blocked our path, thorny bushes tore our clothes, and the ground became boggy in places, sucking at our boots with each step. "Does anyone else feel like the forest is changing around us?" Ethan asked after we'd been walking for about 2 hours. "Like it's rearranging itself?" I'd been thinking the same thing, but had been too afraid to say it aloud. Twice now I noticed landmarks, a distinctive tree, an unusual rock formation that I could have sworn we'd already passed. "That's ridiculous," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Forests don't move." "Maybe we're just going in circles," Rachel suggested, checking behind us. "But the tape markers are still there, leading back to camp." As if conjured by our growing paranoia, a mist began to rise from the ground, curling around our ankles and climbing higher until visibility was reduced to about 20 feet in any direction. "Jess!" I called out, my voice muffled by the thick air. "Jess, can you hear me?" We all went still, listening intently for any response. At first, there was nothing but the drip of condensation from leaves and our own breathing. Then, faintly, from somewhere ahead of us, came a sound that might have been a human voice. "This way," I said, pushing forward with renewed determination. The mist thickened as we pressed on, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath began to fog in front of our faces. "Something's not right," Rachel whispered. "It's August. It shouldn't be this cold." She was right. The temperature had plummeted to what felt like early winter, and I noticed ice crystals forming on the edges of leaves and twigs as we passed. "Maybe we should go back," Ethan suggested, his voice trembling slightly. "Get help." "Park rangers, police, someone with dogs trained for search and rescue." "We can't leave her out here," I insisted, though the rational part of my brain was screaming that Ethan was right. Whatever had taken Jess, person, animal, or something else, we were unprepared to deal with it. A branch snapped loudly to our left, and we all whirled toward the sound, clustered together in defensive formation. "Hello?" Mike called out. "Jess, is that you?" The mist swirled, momentarily clearing to reveal a figure standing about 30 feet away, humanoid but wrong somehow, its proportions subtly distorted. It stood motionless, half hidden behind a tree. "Jess?" Rachel's voice was barely audible. The figure stepped forward, and I felt my reality tilt sideways. It had Jess's face, her familiar features, her dark hair, but the resemblance ended at the neck. The body was too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down to where knees should be, and fingers unnaturally elongated. The legs bent at angles, and though it wore what looked like the tattered remains of Jess's sleeping clothes, patches of grayish skin showed through, covered in what appeared to be coarse, dark hair. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. Jess's warm brown eyes were now milky white, with pinprick pupils that fixed on us with predatory intensity. For one eternal second, we all stood paralyzed with horror. Then the thing that had been Jess opened its mouth, far wider than any human mouth should open, and let out that same howl we'd heard in the night, but up close, it was a sound of such primal hunger that my body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her backward. We scattered, our flight instinct overriding any semblance of coordinated movement. I heard Mike yell in pain somewhere to my right, and Ethan's panicked breathing as he crashed through the underbrush ahead of me. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The mist made navigation impossible. I had no idea if I was heading toward camp or deeper into the forest. Behind me, I could hear movement, fast, quadrupedal movement, gaining on me with each heartbeat. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I rolled onto my back, raising my arms in a futile gesture of self-defense as a shadow loomed over me through the mist. "Please," I gasped. "Jess, if you're in there somewhere." The figure hovering above me paused, tilting its head in an unsettlingly bird-like manner. For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind those milky eyes, recognition, confusion, a silent plea for help. Then a blood-curdling scream tore through the forest, Ethan or Mike, I couldn't tell, and the creature's head snapped toward the sound. It hesitated, looking back at me with what almost seemed like regret, before bounding away into the mist on all fours. I lay there, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, as the forest fell silent once more. I don't know how long I remained there, sprawled on the forest floor, my mind unable to process what I just witnessed. Minutes passed, maybe hours, as the mist swirled around me in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the forest itself was thinking, calculating, watching. Eventually, the primal need for survival pulled me back to my feet. I was alone in a wilderness that suddenly seemed vast beyond comprehension, separated from my friends, being haunted by something wearing Jess's face. "Rachel?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mike? Ethan?" No response came except the soft drip of moisture from the trees and what might have been distant laughter, high-pitched and manic, from somewhere deep in the forest. I tried to orient myself, searching for any sign of our orange trail markers, but the mist obscured everything beyond 20 feet. My watch said it was 2 in the afternoon, but the dim, filtered light made it feel like dusk. I pulled out my phone, knowing it would show no signal, but hoping the GPS might still work. The screen lit up, showing full battery but no service, as expected. What wasn't expected was the time displayed, 7:32. My watch and phone had never been out of sync before. I checked my compass, another rational tool to make sense of an increasingly irrational situation. The needle spun wildly, rotating in complete circles without settling on any direction. That was when the first tendril of true madness began to curl around my mind, the realization that the normal rules, the physical laws I've relied on my entire life, might not apply here. We had crossed some boundary into a place where compass needles spun in circles and time itself couldn't be trusted. I forced myself to focus on immediate needs, find my friends, find our camp, get out of these woods. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking, marking trees with my knife as I went. The forest grew stranger with each step. Trees that should have been familiar species, pine, spruce, birch, began to display subtle abnormalities, bark patterns that shifted when viewed from different angles, leaves that seemed to curl away from my touch as if sentient, fungi in colors I'd never seen in nature. After walking for what felt like hours but might have been minutes, I came upon one of Rachel's orange markers tied to a branch. Relief flooded through me until I realized the marker was behind me, on a path I just traveled. That's impossible. I would have seen it. I turned in a complete circle, trying to get my bearings, and froze when I spotted another marker about 50 feet ahead. Had it been there a moment ago? I couldn't swear it hadn't, but a creeping sense of wrongness settled over me. The rational part of my brain, The engineer who believed in physics and logic was fighting a losing battle against mounting evidence that something truly impossible was happening. People don't transform into monsters. Forests don't rearrange themselves. Trail markers don't appear and disappear. Unless they do in this place. A human cry cut through my spiraling thoughts, Rachel's voice, nearby and filled with terror. I ran toward the sound, no longer caring about marking my path or maintaining direction. Rachel needed help, that was all that mattered. I broke through a dense thicket into a small clearing and found her backed against a massive tree trunk, her face streaked with dirt and tears, clutching a broken branch as a makeshift weapon. Rachel, I called, relief washing over me at finding anyone familiar. She whirled toward me, raising the branch. Stay back, she screamed, her eyes wild with fear. You're not Alex. You can't fool me. I stopped, hands raised. Rachel, it's me. It's really me. No, she moaned, shaking her head violently. I saw you 10 minutes ago. But it wasn't you. It looked like you, but the eyes were wrong, and it spoke with Jess's voice. A chill ran down my spine. Rachel, I swear it's me. Whatever you saw, it wasn't me. Like whatever we saw that looked like Jess wasn't really her. How do I know? She demanded, her voice breaking. How do I know anything anymore? Ask me something only I would know, I suggested, keeping my distance. She hesitated, then, what did you say when Mike first introduced us? I winced at the memory. I asked if you were his sister, and you didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though she kept the branch raised. Where's Mike? And Ethan? I don't know. We all scattered when that thing appeared. I've been looking for everyone since then. Rachel's face crumpled. I heard Mike screaming. It went on, and then it just stopped. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Something's hunting us, Alex. Picking us off one by one. We need to find Ethan and Mike and get back to camp, I said with far more confidence than I felt. Together, we have a better chance. I don't think we can get back, Rachel said, her eyes darting nervously around the clearing. I've been following the markers for hours, but they lead in circles, or to dead ends, or just disappear altogether. Have you noticed anything else strange? I asked. Besides the markers? She laughed, a sound on the edge of hysteria. You mean besides my friend turning into a monster? Besides the forest playing tricks on us? Besides the fact that my phone shows it's midnight when the sun is clearly up? I moved closer, slowly, until I could see her phone screen. She was right, it displayed 12 a.m., while mine now showed 9:47 p.m. Time isn't working right here, I murmured. Neither is space. What does that even mean? Rachel demanded. I don't know. But I think. I hesitated, aware of how insane I was about to sound. I think the forest is alive. Not just alive like plants are alive, but conscious. Aware. And for some reason, it's targeting us. That's crazy, Rachel said, but without conviction. Is it any crazier than what we've seen? I countered. Something happened to Jess. Something is changing the paths, moving our markers, making our devices show different times. It's like we're in a maze that keeps changing, designed by something that's playing with us. A twig snapped behind us, and we both spun toward the sound, Rachel raising her branch again. The mist parted to reveal Ethan stumbling toward us, his left arm hanging limp at his side, dark stains spreading across his torn jacket. "Ethan," I called, starting toward him. Rachel grabbed my arm, her grip painfully tight. "Wait," she hissed. "Are you sure it's him?" The doubt hit me like a physical blow. How could we be sure of anything anymore? "Guys, help me," Ethan gasped, his face pale with shock and pain. Something attacked me, clawed my arm. "I think it's following me." I studied him closely, his movements, his eyes, the timbre of his voice. Everything seemed normal, except... "Where's your camera?" I asked suddenly. Ethan never went anywhere without his expensive DSLR. He blinked, confusion crossing his face. I don't know. Must have lost it when I was running." Rachel and I exchanged glances. Ethan would sooner lose a limb than that camera. "What's the name of the girl you've been texting for the past month?" I pressed, taking a step back. "What?" "Alex, I'm bleeding here." He gestured to his injured arm. "Answer the question," Rachel said, her voice hard. "This is ridiculous." "It's Olivia, okay? Now can you please help me?" I felt my stomach drop. There was no Olivia. Ethan hadn't dated anyone since his breakup 6 months ago. "That's not Ethan," I whispered to Rachel, fighting the urge to run. Not Ethan's expression changed, the pain and confusion melting away, replaced by something cold and calculating. When he smiled, his teeth looked just slightly too sharp, too numerous. "Very observant," he said, but the voice was no longer Ethan's. It was higher, melodic, with an accent I couldn't place. Most people see what they expect to see. What they want to see. "What are you?" Rachel demanded, her voice trembling. "What have you done with our friends?" The thing wearing Ethan's face tilted its head, regarding us with curiosity, like a scientist observing specimens in a lab. "Your friends are part of the forest now. As you will be. As all visitors eventually are." "We're leaving," I said firmly, taking Rachel's hand. "We're going to find Mike and the real Ethan, and we're getting out of here." Not Ethan laughed, the sound rippling outward like a stone dropped in water, echoing back from multiple directions as if the forest itself was laughing with him. "Oh, Alex. Analytical, rational Alex. You still think you can solve this like one of your engineering problems." He took a step toward us, and I noticed with mounting horror that his feet weren't quite touching the ground. "But you can't engineer your way out of the forest. The forest isn't a problem to be solved. It's a hunger to be fed." As he spoke, his form began to blur at the edges, like a photograph going out of focus. His limbs elongated, joints bending at impossible angles. His skin darkened to the color of wet bark, his fingers extending into branch-like appendages. "Run," I whispered to Rachel, and we bolted in opposite directions, a desperate attempt to confuse our pursuer. I crashed through the underbrush, lungs burning, mind reeling. The mist thickened around me, and branches seemed to reach for me as I passed, grabbing at my clothes, scratching my skin. Behind me, I heard Rachel scream, a sound of such profound terror that I knew, with sickening certainty, that I would never see her again. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing beside a small stream that gurgled mockingly in the silence of the forest. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized I could no longer trust my senses, my perception, perhaps even my own mind. Was I still Alex, or was I becoming something else, something of the forest? In the water's reflection, I could see my face streaked with dirt, eyes wild with fear, but for just a moment, I thought I saw something else looking back at me. Something ancient and patient and hungry. And I wondered if it had been there all along. The stream water felt impossibly cold against my skin as I splashed my face, trying to shock myself back to rationality. My hands trembled, and when I looked at them in the dim forest light, I had to count my fingers twice to make sure there were still only 5 on each hand. Don't lose it, Alex. Think. Observe. Analyze. The scientific method had been my North Star since childhood. Observe, hypothesize, test, conclude. But what hypotheses could explain what I'd witnessed? What experiment could I devise to test whether a forest was conscious, hungry, transforming my friends into monsters? I forced myself to catalog what I knew for certain. Jess had disappeared, and something that looked like her but wasn't had attacked us. We'd scattered, and now Rachel was gone too, her screams still echoing in my memory. I'd encountered something pretending to be Ethan, something that changed shape before my eyes. These were observations, facts. The conclusion they pointed to was madness. As the adrenaline ebbed, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. I hadn't slept since the previous night, had barely eaten, had been running on fear and desperation for hours. I needed to rest, but every instinct screamed that sleep meant death in this place. A soft, melodic humming drifted through the trees, a tune that was hauntingly familiar. It was the song Jess used to hum when we were kids, building forts in her backyard. A lullaby her grandmother had taught her. Jess? I called, my voice cracking. Jess, is that really you? The humming stopped abruptly. Then, Alex? Alex, help me, please. It was Jess's voice, not the inhuman howl from before, but her normal voice, tinged with fear and desperation. Every rational thought told me it was a trap, that whatever was hunting me had found my weakness, hope. The possibility, however slim, that my friend was still alive, still herself, somewhere in this nightmare forest. I know you're not her, I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. I saw what happened to her. What you did to her. A figure emerged from the mist about 20 feet away, Jess, looking exactly as she had when we'd set up camp the day before, wearing her favorite hiking pants and faded red fleece. No elongated limbs, no milky eyes, just Jess. It wasn't me, Alex, she said, tears streaming down her face. I wasn't in control. But I am now, at least for a little while. You have to help me before it takes over again. I stood frozen, caught between fear and desperate hope. How do I know it's really you? She wiped at her tears with trembling hands. Remember when we were 9 and my dog ran away? You spent 3 days helping me search, even though you were terrified of dogs after being bitten the year before. You never told me you were scared, but I knew. That's who you are, Alex. You face your fears to help the people you care about. It was such a specific memory, such a Jess thing to say. Could the forest creature know such intimate details of our shared past? What happened to you? I asked, not moving closer but not running either. It's the forest, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if afraid of being overheard. It's old and hungry and patient. It waits for people to wander in, then it separates them, feeds on their fear, transforms them. I tried to fight it, but it's in my head, Alex. It's changing me. She looked down at her hands, and I followed her gaze. With mounting horror, I watched as her fingernails began to lengthen and darken before my eyes, becoming more like claws. She clenched her fists, fighting the transformation. "It's happening again," she gasped. "I don't have much time. You need to get out of here. Follow the stream. It leads to a road eventually." "What about you? And Mike, Rachel, Ethan?" Pain flashed across her face. "Mike is gone. We found him after we separated. Rachel and Ethan might still be alive, but changed, like me." She doubled over suddenly, a cry of pain escaping her lips. "You have to go now." "I can't leave you," I said, taking a step toward her despite every survival instinct screaming against it. "You have to." Her voice distorted mid-sentence, dropping an octave, gaining a reverberating quality that was not human. When she looked up at me, her eyes were beginning to cloud over, the warm brown being consumed by milky white from the edges inward. "Run, Alex. Tell others. Warn them." Her body contorted, bones audibly cracking as they rearranged themselves beneath her skin. Her fleece tore at the shoulders as they broadened and shifted. I backed away, then turned and ran, following the stream as she told me. Behind me, I heard that awful howl again, part human cry, part animal rage, and the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. The stream led downhill, which I took as a good sign. Civilization tended to develop in valleys, not on mountain tops. The water grew wider and faster as I followed it, eventually becoming a proper river rushing over rocks. Darkness was falling quickly now, the forest growing pitch black between the trees while the open area above the river still held the last gray light of dusk. I stumbled more often, my exhausted legs betraying me on the uneven ground. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't be sure if I outrun my hunter or if it was simply toying with me, waiting for exhaustion to claim me. Just as the last light was fading, I spotted something ahead that stopped me in my tracks, a bridge. Not a natural fallen log, but a man-made wooden footbridge spanning the river, its railings decorated with simple carvings. Human construction. Civilization. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I scrambled toward the bridge, nearly sobbing with relief. As I set foot on the weathered planks, a figure rose from the shadows on the far side, a tall, gaunt silhouette backlit by what might have been distant lamplight. "Hello?" I called cautiously. "I need help. I'm lost." The figure didn't respond, but took a step onto the bridge. As it moved into what little light remained, I saw it was an elderly man with a deeply lined face and silver hair, wearing old-fashioned clothes that looked handmade. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place, something old, something not quite modern English. "These woods ain't safe after dark." "I know," I said, fighting the urge to push past him and run toward whatever shelter lay beyond. "My friends and we were camping, and something happened. Something in the forest took them." The old man's expression didn't change. The forest takes what it wants. Has done for centuries. You know about it? What it is?" He nodded slowly. "Some call it a spirit, some a curse. Don't matter what name you give it. What matters is it's hungry, and it's patient, and it's clever." "My friends," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "Can they be saved?" Something like pity crossed his weathered face. "Once the forest has someone, they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." A howl echoed through the trees behind me, closer than I thought, too close. "It's coming," I gasped, looking over my shoulder into the impenetrable darkness. "Get across the bridge, the old man said urgently. The river marks the boundary. It can't cross running water. I didn't question him, just ran forward across the creaking planks. As I reached the midpoint of the bridge, a crash of underbrush announced my pursuer's arrival at the riverbank. I looked back and immediately wished I hadn't. There, at the edge of the forest, stood not one but three figures, the twisted, elongated forms of what had once been Jess, Rachel, and Ethan. Their bodies were only vaguely human now, their limbs bent at impossible angles, their skin the texture of bark, their eyes glowing white in the darkness. But their faces, God, their faces were still recognizable, still bearing the features of my friends, frozen in expressions of agony and hunger. Alex, they called in unison, their voices a discordant chorus of familiar and alien tones. Don't leave us. Stay. Become. Hunger with us. Get across, the old man shouted, snapping me out of my paralysis. I ran the remaining length of the bridge, nearly falling as I reached the far side. Behind me, the creatures that had been my friends approached the water's edge but stopped, pacing back and forth like predators denied their prey. Why can't they cross? I gasped, bent double with exhaustion. Running water disrupts their connection to the forest, the old man explained, watching the creatures with a detached sadness. They're part of it now, extensions of its will. Cut off from it, they'd be nothing but empty husks. I straightened, studying him more carefully. There was something odd about him, a translucence to his edges that I hadn't noticed before, a slight blurring when he moved too quickly. Who are you? I asked, a new fear taking root. He met my gaze, and in his eyes I saw centuries of witnessing the same tragedy play out again and again. Someone who didn't make it across the bridge in time. A cold that had nothing to do with the night air settled in my bones. You're not really here, are you? Not in the way you mean, he acknowledged. The forest took me long ago. But part of me remains, bound to this bridge, warning those who might still escape. I took an involuntary step back, unsure if I traded one supernatural threat for another. Don't fear me, boy, he said softly. I can't harm you. Not like them. He nodded toward the creatures still prowling the far bank, their inhuman howls echoing across the water. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely audible over the rushing of the river and the cries of my former friends. Now you go on, he said, gesturing toward a faint path leading away from the bridge. Follow that trail for about a mile. It'll take you to the old logging road. Another 2 miles east and you'll hit the highway. And my friends? The question felt hollow even as I asked it. The old man's face softened with genuine sympathy. They belong to the forest now. In time, they'll forget they were ever human. The hunger will become all they know. There must be something I can do, I insisted, even as the rational part of my brain accepted the impossible truth before me. You can remember them as they were, he said. And you can warn others to stay away from these woods. He turned to look back at the creatures, his form growing more transparent by the second. The forest is always hungry, but it can't hunt. It needs people to wander in willingly. As if sensing our conversation was about them, the three figures on the far bank grew still, their glowing eyes fixed on us. Then, as one, they tilted their heads back and released a howl that sounded like grief and rage and hunger all at once, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Go, the old man urged, his voice growing faint as his form dispersed like mist. Before they find another way to reach you. I didn't need further encouragement. I turned and ran down the path, not looking back, not slowing until the sounds of the forest and the river and the howling creatures had faded into the distance. The old logging road appeared exactly where the ghostly man had said it would, its gravel surface the first sign of civilization I'd seen in what felt like a lifetime. I followed it eastward, moving on autopilot, my mind unable to process everything I'd experienced. When the highway finally came into view, its asphalt gleaming under the moonlight, I fell to my knees and wept for my lost friends, for the nightmare I'd survived, for the knowledge that would forever separate me from the person I'd been just days ago. A truck driver found me there an hour later, huddled on the shoulder of the road, talking to myself, trying to make sense of the insensible. He thought I was drunk or high at first, but something in my eyes must have convinced him otherwise. As he helped me into his cab, I looked back toward the dark line of trees in the distance. For just a moment, I thought I saw 3 pairs of glowing eyes watching from the forest's edge, patient, hungry, waiting. And I wondered how many others would wander into those woods, never to return as themselves. How do you return to normal life after discovering that reality is thinner than you thought, that nightmares can bleed through into the waking world? The answer, I've found, is that you don't. The police were sympathetic but skeptical when I reported my friends missing. Search parties combed the area where I'd emerged from the forest, but they refused to cross the river, refused to venture deep into those northern woods despite my desperate pleas. Perhaps on some primal level, they sensed what I knew with certainty, that something ancient and hungry waited there, patient and clever. People get lost in these woods all the time, the search coordinator told me with practiced sympathy. Especially tourists who don't respect the wilderness. Sometimes we find them, sometimes we don't. They found our campsite eventually, untouched except for the missing tent. They found Mike's camera with photos of our first 2 days, smiling faces, spectacular views, no end of the horror to come. They found no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle or animal attack. Just 4 backpacks in a clearing and 1 missing tent. Probably bears, they concluded. Your friends might have run in different directions. They could still turn up. But I knew they wouldn't, not as themselves, at least. The families were harder to face than the authorities. How could I tell Jess's parents that their daughter had transformed into something inhuman before my eyes? How could I explain to Rachel's fiancé that I'd heard her final scream as the forest claimed her? How could I tell Ethan's sister that something was wearing her brother's face like a mask? So I lied. I told them we got separated in bad weather. I told them I searched as long as I could. I told them I was sure the professional search teams would find them. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Weeks passed. The search was scaled back, then officially called off. Missing persons reports remained open, but active investigations ceased. The families held memorial services with empty caskets, finding what closure they could without bodies to bury. I attended each service, standing in the back, unable to meet the tearful gazes of parents and siblings and lovers. Their grief was clean, uncomplicated by the knowledge that tormented me that somewhere in those woods, the things that had once been my friends still prowled, still hungered, still waited. Sleep became my enemy. Each night, the same dreams came. I'm running through endless trees while howls echo all around me. I reach the bridge, but it stretches impossibly long before me. Behind me, my friends approach, not as monsters, but as themselves, calling my name, asking why I abandoned them. I wake gasping, convinced I can smell pine needles and damp earth in my bedroom, miles from any forest. 3 months after my escape, I received a package at my apartment. No return address, just my name written in shaky, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single item, Ethan's camera, which the police had never recovered from the forest. With trembling hands, I turned it on, dreading what I might find. The battery was nearly dead, but it had enough power to show me the last images captured, blurry photos taken in near darkness, showing twisted tree trunks that looked oddly like human limbs. Faces that might be bark formations or might be human features frozen in silent screams. And in the final image, 3 figures standing at the edge of a clearing, elongated, inhuman, but with eyes I recognized even through the distortion and poor lighting. Jess, Rachel, Mike. On the back of the camera, scratched into the plastic in crude letters, they remember you. I moved after that. Changed my name. Tried to build a new life far from Maine, far from any forest. But distance provides no real escape from nightmares, especially when you carry them inside you. Sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, I hear what sounds like distant howling. On foggy mornings, I find myself checking my fingers, counting to make sure there are still only 5 on each hand. And I avoid reflective surfaces in dim lighting, fearful of what might look back at me. Last week, I received a postcard. No message, just a picture of dense Maine woods with a wooden bridge crossing a river. And below the image, a single line of text, "The forest misses you." I burned it immediately, but the image is seared into my memory. And sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleeping, I find myself wondering if I truly escaped that night. If the old man on the bridge was real or just another trick of the forest. If I made it across the boundary, or if what emerged was something else wearing Alex's skin, carrying Alex's memories. After all, the forest is patient. And clever. And always, always hungry. Tonight, as I finish writing this account, I've made a decision. Tomorrow I'll return to those woods in northern Maine. Not to the tourist trails or the campgrounds with their illusion of safety, but to the wild places where the trees grow too close together and mist rises from the ground even on clear days. I'll find the stream, follow it to the bridge. Perhaps my friends are still there, waiting. Perhaps I never truly left. And perhaps, this time, I won't run. Because the truth is, ever since I escaped those woods, I've felt a gnawing emptiness inside me. A hunger that normal food doesn't satisfy. A longing for something I can't name. The forest is calling. And somewhere deep in my changing bones, I feel myself answering. So if you're reading this, consider it both confession and warning. Stay away from the northern woods of Maine, especially those unmarked on tourist maps. Don't hike alone, don't camp overnight, and if you hear something that sounds like a human voice calling from between the trees, run, don't walk in the opposite direction. But most importantly, if you ever find yourself near a wooden bridge crossing a river in those woods, and you see a man who looks like me urging you to cross quickly, don't trust him. After all, the forest is patient. And clever. And I am so very, very hungry. Have you ever felt a place remember you before you've even arrived? The wipers struggled against the relentless rain as I pulled into the cracked parking lot of the Pinewood Motel. Nebraska's endless cornfields had given way to this lonely outpost on Highway 29, a forgotten stretch of American asphalt that seemed to exist in its own pocket of time. My eyelids felt like sandpaper after 12 hours of driving, and the glowing vacancy sign was the only lighthouse in a sea of prairie darkness. The neon cast a sickly crimson glow across the dashboard, painting my knuckles blood red as I turned off the ignition. Outside, the rain hammered down in sheets, transforming the motel's exterior into a watery mirage. Something about this place felt wrong, not dangerous, exactly, but like walking into a room where all the furniture has been shifted 2 inches to the left. The office bell jangled as I pushed through the door, shaking droplets from my coat. A television murmured from somewhere behind the front desk, bathing the wood-paneled walls in flickering blue light. "Hello?" My voice sounded hollow in the empty space. A rustling from the back room preceded the appearance of the night clerk, a man with thin gray hair and skin that hung too loosely on his bones. His smile never reached his eyes. "Welcome to Pinewood," he said, his voice like tires on gravel. "Just you tonight?" I nodded, sliding my credit card across the countertop. As he processed my payment, I noticed a framed newspaper clipping on the wall. Something about a local disappearance. 2 people, actually. The headline was faded, but the date was clear, October 4th, 1976. "Any preference on room?" he asked, sliding a registration card toward me. "Whatever's quiet," I replied. "Been driving all day." His eyes met mine for the first time, and an inexplicable chill crawled up my spine. 308 should do nicely then, he said, lips twitching into something approximating a smile. End of the hall. Nice and quiet. As he handed me the key, an actual metal key, not a card, his fingertips brushed against my palm. They were ice cold despite the stuffiness of the room. 308 hasn't had a visitor in some time, he added, almost to himself. It's been waiting. I should have asked what he meant. I should have requested a different room. Instead, I thanked him, grabbed my overnight bag from the car, and trudged through the rain to the second-floor exterior walkway. Room 308 was at the very end, as promised. The brass numbers hung slightly askew, the 0 drooping like a mournful eye. The key stuck in the lock, requiring a forceful jiggle before the mechanism finally released with a reluctant click. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing a room frozen in the amber of decades past. Faded floral wallpaper, a boxy television, and a queen bed with a burgundy coverlet that had seen better days. The air smelled of mothballs and something else, something metallic and vaguely organic that I couldn't place. I flicked on the lights, half expecting them not to work, but the room illuminated under the harsh fluorescence. Everything looked normal enough. Dated, certainly, but normal. Yet as I set my bag down on the luggage rack, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was breathing. Not literally, of course, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the still air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The bathroom light flickered as I washed road grime from my hands. In the mirror, dark circles underscored my eyes, giving me a haunted look. For a moment, just the briefest flash, I thought I saw someone standing behind me in the reflection. I whirled around, heart hammering against my ribs, but found only the empty doorway. Get it together, I muttered, splashing cold water on my face. It's just fatigue. Back in the main room, I pulled back the curtains to look out at the storm. The rain had intensified, beating a violent tattoo against the glass. Lightning split the sky, and in that electric instant, I swore I saw figures standing in the parking lot below, looking up at my window. The darkness swallowed it before I could be certain. As I let the curtain fall back into place, my eyes caught on something scratched into the window frame, tiny, desperate-looking letters carved into the wood. Don't sleep. They come in dreams. I ran my fingers over the etching, feeling the jagged desperation of each letter. A sick joke from a previous guest, no doubt. There was no they. Just my imagination and the echo chamber of exhaustion. I pulled out my phone to check for messages, but the screen showed no service. Of course. Places like this existed in dead zones, communication voids where the outside world couldn't reach. The heater clicked on with a metallic groan, pushing stale air through the vents. As I unpacked my toiletries, I could have sworn I heard something that wasn't the rain or the heater, a soft, rhythmic sound like fingernails tapping on the other side of the wall. Tap, tap, tap. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper. Nothing. Then it came again, this time from inside the closet. Tap, tap, tap. My mouth went dry. I approached the closet door slowly, convincing myself it was just the pipes or the building settling. Old motels made noise. That was normal. The brass knob was cold in my palm as I pulled the door open in one quick motion. Empty hangers rattled against the rod. Nothing else. I exhaled slowly, feeling foolish. It was just an empty closet in a cheap motel room. Nothing sinister about that. As I turned away, the light overhead flickered, and for a split second, the room transformed. In that momentary darkness, the walls seemed to stretch impossibly tall, the bed became a shadowy altar, and the bathroom door yawned open onto absolute blackness. Then the light stabilized, and everything was normal again. Except for the wet footprints leading from the bathroom to the bed. Footprints that weren't mine. I blinked, and they were gone. That's it, I said aloud, my voice steadier than I felt. I need sleep. I double-checked the door lock and wedged the single chair under the handle for good measure. As an afterthought, I checked under the bed too. Nothing but dust bunnies and a forgotten penny. Exhaustion wound over unease as I crawled under the covers, fully clothed except for my shoes. Just a few hours of sleep, I promised myself. In the morning, everything would look different. Less ominous. Less alive. As consciousness began to slip away, the room seemed to inhale around me. The walls contracted slightly, the ceiling lowered by inches. The tap-tap-tapping returned, now from all sides at once, like dozens of impatient fingers drumming for my attention. And just before sleep claimed me completely, I heard a voice, soft and close and terribly familiar, whispered directly into my ear. We've been waiting for you in 308. We knew you'd come back. I hadn't been here before. Had I? My last conscious thought was that I shouldn't have stopped at the Pinewood Motel. I shouldn't have taken room 308. But some part of me knew I'd never had a choice. What's the difference between a dream and a memory when both feel equally real? I jolted awake at 3:17 according to the glowing red digits of the bedside clock. The rain had stopped, leaving behind an unnatural silence that pressed against my eardrums. Something had woken me, a sound, a movement, a presence. The room was darker than it should have been. Moonlight should have filtered through the gap in the curtains, but outside was pitch black, as if the motel had been swallowed by a void. The only illumination came from the clock's crimson numbers, painting the room in a bloody glow. I lay perfectly still, listening to the silence. No, not silence, there was something else. A soft, rhythmic sound, barely audible even in the quiet room. Breathing. Someone or something was breathing, slow and deliberate, from the corner by the television. My own breath caught in my throat. I strained my eyes, trying to penetrate the darkness, but could make out only vague shapes in the gloom. Hello? My voice was a ragged whisper. The breathing stopped. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, fingers trembling as they found the switch. Click. Nothing happened. I tried again. Click, click. The room remained cloaked in darkness. power's out," came a voice from the corner. A woman's voice, soft and slurred, as if speaking underwater. "It's always out at this hour." Ice flooded my veins. I scrambled upright, pressing my back against the headboard. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. A match flared in the darkness, illuminating a face that sent tremors of recognition through me, though I'd never seen it before. A woman in her 30s, blonde hair plastered to her skull as if wet, eyes reflecting the matchlight like a nocturnal animal. Her skin had a grayish cast to it, and dark water dripped steadily from her sodden clothes, forming a puddle on the carpet. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, the matchlight dancing in her dilated pupils. "But we all come back to 308 eventually." Before I could respond, she blew out the match, plunging the room back into darkness. The wet sound of footsteps approached the bed. I fumbled for my phone, fingers closing around it just as the mattress depressed with sudden weight at its foot. The phone screen illuminated, casting a ghostly blue glow across the room. There was no one there. The foot of the bed showed no indentation, the carpet was dry, and I was alone. But the air felt charged, like the millisecond before lightning strikes. And despite the emptiness revealed by my phone's light, I couldn't shake the certainty that I was being watched by eyes just beyond the circle of illumination. My phone screen showed 3:22 a.m. Still no service. I kept the light on, sweeping it around the room like a lighthouse beacon. Everything looked normal, worn but ordinary. The closet door remained closed. The bathroom door stood ajar, revealing darkness beyond. As I moved to swing my legs off the bed, my feet touched something wet. I jerked back, aiming my phone's light downward. A dark puddle had formed beside the bed, spreading outward from beneath it. Water? It looked too thick for water. With trembling fingers, I reached down and touched it. My fingertips came away red. The phone slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor and landing face down, extinguishing its light. Darkness swallowed the room once more. In that moment, the silence broke. A whisper, no, multiple whispers, filled the room, overlapping in a cacophony of urgent voices too soft to understand. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, building in intensity until I had to cover my ears. "Stop!" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the rising tide of whispers. The temperature plummeted, my breath suddenly visible in white puffs. Something cold and wet wrapped around my ankle, fingers, I realized with stomach-churning clarity. Fingers emerging from beneath the bed. I kicked wildly, scrambling off the mattress and across the room, colliding with the dresser. Pain exploded through my hip, but I barely registered it through the surge of adrenaline. My hands scrabbled across the dresser top, searching desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. They closed around a heavy object, the Bible from the drawer, I realized. The whispers abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was somehow worse. "They always leave a Bible," said the woman's voice, now directly behind me. "Never helped any of us." I whirled around, Bible clutched to my chest like a shield. In the dim red glow of the clock, I could just make out her silhouette. Water, or something darker, dripped steadily from her outstretched hand. "Who are you?" I demanded, voice cracking. "What do you want?" "You know who I am," she said, taking a step closer. "Just like you know what happens in 308. "I've never been here before," I insisted, but even as the words left my mouth, something stirred in the back of my mind, an image, fragmented and blurry, of this very room under different circumstances. Me, standing where she stood now. Someone else, backing away in terror. No, that wasn't possible. I'd never set foot in Nebraska before today. The woman tilted her head, with hair sliding across her face. We all say that the first time we come back, it gets easier to remember with each visit. My back pressed against the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. I don't understand, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. 308 remembers, she replied, gesturing to the walls around us. Even when we don't, it remembers what we did here. A flash of memory, hands covered in red, a muffled scream, the squelch of something heavy being dragged across carpet. I shook my head violently. That's not mine. That's not my memory. Isn't it? She was close enough now that I could smell her, a musty, stagnant odor like a pond in summer. Check the bathroom. We all check eventually. My eyes darted to the bathroom door, still slightly ajar. Something about it felt wrong, like it opened onto a space larger than a small bathroom should be. Go on, she urged, her voice almost gentle now. See what 308 wants you to see. Against every instinct screaming for me to run, I found myself drawn toward the bathroom door. My hand reached out, pushing it wider. Darkness yawned beyond, deeper and more absolute than mere absence of light. It was a tangible darkness, one that seemed to breathe and pulse with malevolent life. And from somewhere within it came the sound of water, not the patter of rain or the drip of a faucet, but the slow, deliberate splash of something moving through standing water. I hesitated at the threshold, unable to force myself to step inside. Instead, I reached around the doorframe, fingers searching for the light switch. They touched something wet and yielding instead. Something that grabbed hold and began to pull. I screamed, yanking my arm back with such force that I stumbled and fell. The room's atmosphere changed instantly, becoming charged with electric anticipation. The red glow of the clock intensified, casting bloody shadows across every surface. From the bathroom emerged a figure, not the dripping woman, but something else. Something misshapen and wrong, its proportions distorted like a reflection in warped glass. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, water sluicing from its form with each lurching step. I scrambled backward, Bible still clutched in one hand, the other groping for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around my fallen phone. I raised it, activating the screen, and aimed its light at the approaching figure. The light passed through it as if it were smoke, illuminating only empty air. But in the mirror behind it, a mirror that should have shown only my own terrified reflection, I saw myself staring back with an expression of malicious glee, hands dripping red. That other me raised a finger to its lips in a shushing gesture, then pointed down at something out of frame. Though every cell in my body screamed against it, my eyes followed the direction of its point, down to the bathroom floor reflected in the mirror. There, sprawled in a pool of spreading crimson, lay a body. The room spun around me. Bile rose in my throat as fragments of memory assaulted my consciousness, the weight of the knife in my hand, the surprised expression as it plunged home, the warmth of blood between my fingers. The exhilaration. The power. No, I moaned, squeezing my eyes shut. That's not me. That's not what happened. 308 knows what happened, came the woman's voice, now sounding from everywhere at once. 308 never forgets. When I opened my eyes again, the room was normal. The overhead light was on, bright and steady. No dripping woman, no distorted figure, no spreading pool of blood. Just a dated motel room at, I glanced at the clock, 3:44 in the morning. I sat on the floor, trembling, trying to convince myself it had been a nightmare. Just a vivid, terrible dream brought on by exhaustion and an overactive imagination primed by the clerk's strange comments. Then my gaze fell on my phone, still clutched in my hand. The screen displayed a photo I had no memory of taking, a close-up of the wall behind the bed, where something had been written in what looked like rust-colored paint. 30H8 knows what you did, 30H8 knows you'll do it again. I stared at the wall, but there was no writing there now. Just faded wallpaper with its endless pattern of tiny blue flowers. Sleep was no longer an option. I had to get out of this room, this motel, this state. I gathered my few belongings with shaking hands, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the bathroom door, which remained slightly open, revealing only ordinary darkness beyond. As I reached for the doorknob, the overhead light flickered once, twice, then stabilized. But in those brief moments of darkness, I'd seen her again. The dripping woman. Standing right behind me, her cold breath on my neck, her wet fingers inches from my shoulder. I wrenched the door open and stumbled out onto the exterior walkway, gulping the cool night air like a drowning man breaking the surface. The parking lot below was empty except for my car, a solitary island in a sea of cracked asphalt. The night sky stretched overhead, pinpricked with stars, utterly ordinary. Maybe I really had fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe. A movement in my peripheral vision made me turn. At the far end of the walkway stood a figure, the night clerk, watching me with those empty eyes. Despite the distance between us, I heard his voice clearly, as if he were standing right beside me. "Checking out so soon?" he asked, his lips barely moving. "But 308 isn't finished with you yet." I ran for the stairs, keys clutched so tightly they bit into my palm. Behind me, I heard the soft click of room 308's door swinging shut of its own accord. I had to get away. I had to put miles between myself and the Pinewood Motel. But as I slid behind the wheel of my car, a terrible certainty settled over me like a shroud. No matter how far I drove, 308 was coming with me. And somewhere deep inside, a voice I didn't recognize whispered that I would be back. We always come back to room 308. Is it possible to flee from something that's already inside you? 400 miles of asphalt stretched between me and the Pinewood Motel, yet I could still feel room 308 clinging to me like a second skin. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension as I pushed eastward through the gray dawn. I hadn't slept since fleeing that cursed room. Coffee cups and energy drink cans littered the passenger seat, physical totems of my desperation to stay awake. Because sleep meant dreams, and dreams might take me back there. The highway unspooled before me, an endless ribbon cutting through farmland. Normal. Mundane. But the rational daylight world felt thin somehow, like a veneer that might crack at any moment, revealing the wrongness lurking beneath. My phone rang, startling me so badly I swerved onto the shoulder before correcting. The screen showed unknown caller. I almost didn't answer, but the thought of a human voice, any voice that wasn't a whisper from 308, was too tempting. "Hello?" My own voice sounded foreign to my ears, raspy from caffeine and fear. Static hissed through the speaker, punctuated by what might have been words, too distorted to understand. "Hello?" I repeated. "I can't hear you." The static cleared momentarily, just long enough for 3 words to slip through with perfect clarity. "Come back, murderer." I hurled the phone onto the passenger seat as if it had burned me. It continued to emit static, growing louder until it filled the car like a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums. "Stop it!" I shouted, punching the radio to drown out the noise. The radio came to life, but instead of music, a familiar voice emerged from the speakers, the night clerk from the Pinewood. Guests of 308 always return. The room makes sure of it. I jabbed at the radio buttons frantically, but every station played the same voice, saying the same words over and over. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the speedometer past 90. I had to outrun this, outrun the voice, outrun the memories that weren't mine, couldn't be mine. The landscape outside began to blur, colors bleeding together like wet paint. The rational part of my brain knew this was dangerous. I was exhausted, hallucinating, in no condition to drive. But stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant returning to 308. A green highway sign loomed ahead, Millersburg, 20 miles. A town meant people, witnesses, anchors to reality. I just had to make it there, find a new motel, one without rooms that whispered and bled and remembered. The radio static abruptly ceased, leaving a silence so profound it felt like pressure in my ears. In that silence, I heard water dripping in the back seat. Drip, drip, drip. I refused to look in the rearview mirror. If I didn't see her, she wasn't there. The dripping woman from 308 couldn't be here, 300 miles from where I'd left her. "You're not real," I said firmly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Neither are you, anymore," came her fluid voice from directly behind my ear. "Not since your first visit to 308. Ice crawled up my spine. In the windshield's reflection, I could just make out her face hovering behind my shoulder, pale, bloated, eyes like dark pits in her waterlogged face. "I've never been there before," I insisted through clenched teeth. "That wasn't my memory." "The night felt good in your hand, didn't it?" she whispered, her breath cold against my neck. "The power. Making someone else feel as empty as you do inside." "Shut up." I swore violently, as if I could shake her off. "You're in my head. You're not real." Her laughter bubbled like water through a drain. "Ask yourself, if I'm not real, what does that make you?" My hands clutched the steering wheel so tightly I could feel my pulse hammering through my palms. Outside, the landscape had changed. The open farmland had given way to dense forest pressing close to the highway's shoulders. Trees I didn't recognize, too tall, too dark, too close together. This wasn't Nebraska. This wasn't anywhere I knew. The mile markers were wrong too. The last had read 33. The next read 308. The back of my neck prickled. I checked the gas gauge, nearly empty, though I'd filled up just 2 hours ago. The dashboard clock read 3:08 p.m., though sunrise had been less than an hour ago. Reality was unraveling around me, the threads of the normal world pulling apart to reveal something else beneath. Something that had always been there, waiting. The highway curved sharply ahead, revealing a familiar silhouette against the darkening sky, the Pinewood Motel, its neon sign buzzing in the twilight. Impossible. I'd been driving away from it for hours. "No," I whispered, easing my foot off the accelerator. "This isn't happening." 308 is patient," said the dripping woman, her voice now coming from the passenger seat. I still refused to look. "It waits for its guests to return. And they always do." The car began to slow, the engine sputtering as if the gas tank were completely dry. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the vehicle continued to coast, momentum carrying it inexorably toward the motel's entrance. With a final, dying gasp, the engine cut out completely. The car rolled to a stop in the exact same parking space I'd used before, as if guided there by invisible hands. Silence descended, broken only by the buzz of the neon sign and the steady drip of water from my unseen passenger. The keys turned in the ignition of their own accord, slipping from the slot and into my palm with a cold finality. "Why are you doing this to me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "We're not doing anything," replied the woman. 308 is. I finally turned to face her, expecting the bloated, dripping apparition from my nightmares. Instead, I found only an empty seat with what looked like ordinary water. Outside, twilight had deepened into true night. The motel's windows glowed with warm light, an inviting beacon in the darkness. It looked harmless, mundane, just a dated roadside stop where weary travelers could rest. But I knew better now. 308 was waiting. I couldn't stay in the car forever. Eventually, exhaustion would claim me, and then where would I be? Better to face whatever waited inside than to sit paralyzed by fear. With trembling fingers, I opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air. The parking lot was empty except for my car, just as it had been before. The office light burned steadily, promising human contact, however unsettling the night clerk might be. Perhaps I could request a different room. Perhaps 308's malevolence was contained within its walls, and I would be safe elsewhere in the motel. I approached the office slowly, each step requiring conscious effort. Through the window, I could see the night clerk watching television, his face illuminated by its flickering blue light. Normal. Ordinary. Safe. The bell jangled as I pushed through the door, the sound identical to my first visit. The night clerk looked up, and recognition flickered across his face. "Back so soon?" he asked, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I need a room," I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. He tilted his head, studying me with those empty eyes. 308 is available. "Any room but that one," I replied immediately. His thin lips stretched into something approximating a smile. "I'm afraid 308 is the only vacant room tonight. The others are occupied." I glanced through the window at the empty parking lot. There are no other cars. "Our guests prefer privacy," he said, sliding the registration book across the counter. "Now, will you be taking 308 or continuing your journey?" I stared at the registration book. The page showed a single vacant room, 308, with all others marked as occupied. The names in the other slots were blurred, indistinct, impossible to read clearly no matter how I squinted. "I'll sleep in my car," I decided aloud. The clerk's smile never wavered. "As you wish. But 308 will still be here when you change your mind." He slid a key across the counter, the same key I'd returned hours earlier. Just in case. Against my better judgment, I took it. The brass was cold against my palm, heavier than a key should be. Back in the car, I reclined the seat as far as it would go and tried to get comfortable. Sleep was out of the question, but I could rest, gather my strength, wait for daylight. In the morning, I'd find a phone that worked and call for help. A tow truck, a taxi, anything to get me away from this place. Hours crawled by. The digital clock on the dashboard remained frozen at 308, its red digits casting a bloody glow across the interior. Outside, nothing moved. No cars passed on the highway. No lights went on or off in the motel rooms. The night clerk remained at his post, visible through the office window, never shifting position. My eyelids grew heavier with each passing minute. I pinched myself, slapped my cheeks, anything to stay awake. But 3 nights without sleep had exacted their toll. My consciousness began to slip, darkness encroaching at the edges of my vision. I jerked awake to the sound of tapping on the window. The night clerk stood outside, his face a pale oval in the darkness. 308 is waiting, he mouthed through the glass. I closed my eyes, willing him to disappear. When I opened them again, he was gone. But the key in my hand had grown warmer, almost hot to the touch. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a figure walking along the upper walkway, pausing outside room 308. A woman, her silhouette unmistakable even at this distance. She turned to look down at me, water streaming from her clothes to pool on the concrete. She beckoned, a single crooking of fingers, then opened the door to 308 and stepped inside. The key burned against my palm, demanding use. 308 was calling, and the pull was becoming irresistible. Whatever waited inside that room was part of me now, a connection I couldn't sever by simply driving away. With resignation settling over me like a shroud, I exited the car and climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor. Each step felt both inevitable and like a betrayal of myself. I was a moth drawn to deadly flame, unable to resist the light even knowing it meant destruction. Room 308's door stood slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling onto the walkway. From inside came the sound of running water. I pushed the door open wider, revealing the room exactly as I'd left it, the rumpled bed, the dated furniture, the bathroom door slightly open. Nothing overtly threatening. Nothing obviously wrong. Except everything was wrong. The air felt too thick, as if the oxygen had been replaced with something heavier, harder to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, expanding and contracting like lungs. And the light had a strange quality to it, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. "Hello?" I called out, voice barely above a whisper. The bathroom door swung open wider, revealing the dripping woman standing before the mirror. She didn't turn to acknowledge me, just stared at her reflection with a terrible intensity. "You need to see," she said, her voice clearer now, less fluid. 308 is showing you. You just need to remember. Remember what? I asked, taking an involuntary step toward her. She turned then, fixing me with those dark, empty eyes. What you did here. What we all did here. Another flash of memory, not mine, couldn't be mine, of hands on flesh, a knife rising and falling, blood spreading across tile. I've never killed anyone, I insisted, but my voice lacked conviction. 308 knows better, she replied. It remembers for us. It keeps part of every guest who stayed here. The ones who killed. The ones who died. All part of 308 now. She extended a dripping hand toward me. Come see your reflection. See who you really are. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I found myself moving forward, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear. One step. Two. The bathroom threshold loomed before me, that impossible darkness beyond seeming to reach out with grasping tendrils. I stopped at the edge, peering into the gloom. The mirror was just visible, reflecting a face that was mine but not mine, features I recognized arranged in an expression I didn't. Eyes too wide, smile too broad, something feral and hungry in the gaze that met mine. That's not me, I whispered. It's what 308 sees, said the woman, now standing directly beside me though I hadn't seen her move. What it remembers. What it keeps. She placed her cold, wet hand on my shoulder, and with that touch came a flood of images, room 308 throughout the decades, different guests, different victims, but always the same outcome. Blood on tile. Bodies wrapped in sheets. The night clerk helping to load weighted bundles into car trunks under cover of darkness. And me. Always me, in different bodies, different lives, but always returning to 308. To kill again. To feed the room's hunger. I staggered backward, breaking contact with the dripping woman, desperate to escape the terrible visions. My back hit the wall, the impact sending the framed landscape picture crashing to the floor. Its glass shattered, revealing something hidden behind it, a cavity in the wall, stuffed with driver's licenses, dozens of them, gathered over decades. I knelt, picking up one that had fallen free. The face in the photo was unfamiliar, but the name printed beside it sent ice through my veins. My name. My birth date. But issued 30 years ago. We all come back to 308, said the dripping woman, now standing over me. Different bodies. Different lives. But the same souls. Murderer and victim, bound to this place. Playing our roles again and again. I looked up at her, truly seeing her face clearly for the first time. Recognition hit me like a physical blow, not from this life, but from somewhere deeper, older. I knew her. Had always known her. Who are you to me? I whispered, the license trembling in my grasp. The first, she said simply. You're first in 308. Mine was the blood that began your cycle here. The room seemed to contract around us, the walls bending inward as if listening. The air grew heavier, charged with anticipation. I don't want this, I said, rising to my feet. I don't want to remember. 308 doesn't care what you want, she replied. It needs what it needs. The cycle continues. Someone dies in 308 tonight. Her eyes held mine, and within their depths I saw my reflection, not as I was now, but as I had been in that other life, hands stained crimson, eyes alight with terrible purpose. No, I said, backing toward the door. I'm leaving. Breaking the cycle. Her laughter followed me, cold water spilling from her mouth with each sound. You can check out any time you like, she said, the words familiar yet wrong, twisted into something sinister. But you can never leave. I fumbled with the door handle, fingers slick with sweat. It wouldn't turn. The lock had engaged itself, trapping me inside with her, with the memories, with 308's hunger. Outside, beyond the curtained window, I heard footsteps on the walkway. Heavy. Purposeful. Coming toward room 308. The dripping woman's expression changed, fear replacing malice. It's time, she whispered. He's coming. Who? I demanded, still struggling with the door. The night clerk, she replied, backing toward the bathroom. He serves 308 too. Brings it what it needs. Fresh souls for the cycle. A key scraped in the lock. The handle turned. The door began to open, revealing the night clerk's gaunt silhouette against the darkness beyond. In his hand gleamed a knife. When does a nightmare become reality? Or has reality been the nightmare all along? The night clerk stepped into room 308, the door swinging shut behind him with the finality of a tomb ceiling. The knife in his hand caught the light, its edge honed to wicked sharpness. You've returned, he said, his voice devoid of surprise. They always do. I backed away, eyes darting between him and the dripping woman who had pressed herself against the bathroom doorframe. Her face reflected not fear, I realized, but anticipation, the tension of an actor awaiting their cue. What is this place? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. What do you want from me? The clerk tilted his head, studying me with those empty eyes. What? Nothing. 308 once. We merely serve. He gestured with the knife, encompassing the room with a sweeping motion. This place has existed longer than the motel. Longer than the road. The Pawnee knew not to build here. The settlers learned too late. You're insane, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. After what I'd seen, what I'd felt, insanity seemed the more comforting explanation. The clerk's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Insanity would be a mercy. This is something older. Something umbreer. He took a step toward me. 308 must be fed. Blood spilled by guilty hands. It's been this way for generations. Another fragment of memory surfaced, the weight of the knife in my hand, the resistance of flesh, the rush of power as life drained away. But now I could see further back, to my arrival at the motel, to the clerk watching me with those same empty eyes, to the key placed in my palm with deliberate intent. You set me up, I realized aloud. You brought me here to kill her. I nodded toward the dripping woman, who remained unnaturally still by the bathroom door. The clerk's expression didn't change. I merely opened the door. What happens in 308 is between you, her, and the room. He extended the knife toward me, handle first. The cycle continues. As it always has. As it always will. I stared at the offered weapon, horrified by the impulse to take it. Something dark stirred within me, a hunger that mirrored the room's own. Part of me, a part I'd never acknowledged, never known existed, wanted to feel that power again. No, I said, forcing the word through clenched teeth. I won't be part of this. The dripping woman laughed, the sound like stones rolling underwater. You already are. Have been for longer than you know. She pointed to the fallen driver's licenses scattered across the carpet. How many times have you returned? How many versions of yourself have fed 308's hunger? The clerk stepped closer, the knife still extended. Take it, he urged, his voice hypnotic in its monotony. Fulfill your purpose. Complete the cycle. My hands remained at my sides, clenched into fists so tight that my nails cut into my palms. The pain anchored me, kept me from reaching for the blade. And if I refuse? I asked. The clerk's expression hardened. Then the roles reverse. The killer becomes the killed. 308 must be fed, one way or another. The dripping woman pushed away from the bathroom doorframe, moving with sudden purpose toward me. I've waited decades for this moment, she said, her voice thick with anticipation. For you to return. For the skills to balance. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. The clerk blocked the exit, the woman advanced from the bathroom, and between them, the knife hung in the air like a promise. Please, I said, though I wasn't sure who I was begging, them, the room, or some higher power that might still be listening. I'm not a killer. Not in this life, agreed the clerk. Not yet. But 308 remembers what you were. What you will be again. He pressed the knife into my unwilling hand, closing my fingers around the handle with his cold, dry grip. The moment skin met metal, the room changed. The walls receded, stretching impossibly far in all directions. The ceiling soared upward into darkness. The floor beneath my feet became transparent, revealing layer upon layer of identical rooms stacked below, each a version of 308 from different times, different decades. In each, the same scene played out with different actors, a killer, a victim, the night clerk standing witness. And in every iteration, I saw myself. Sometimes wielding the knife, sometimes feeling its bite, but always there, bound to 308 through cycles of death and return. "You see now," said the clerk, his voice echoing strangely in the transformed space. 308 is a crossroads, a place where souls meet to balance ancient debts. What was taken must be returned. What was given must be reclaimed. The dripping woman stood before me, water pooling at her feet. But now I could see beyond her sodden appearance to the wound that had ended her life, a ragged gash across her throat, inflicted by the very knife I now held. "You took my life in 1976, she said, touching the spectral wound. "Now the debt comes due." Memory crashed over me like a wave, not fragmented glimpses, but the full, terrible weight of recollection. I had been someone else then, a drifter with dead eyes and a taste for suffering. 308 had called to me as it did now, promising refuge from my darkest impulses. And she had been my victim, chosen for no reason beyond her availability and the hunger of the room. "I'm not that person anymore," I said, the knife suddenly heavy in my hand. "I don't want this." "One has nothing to do with it," replied the clerk. 308 demands balance. Blood for blood. Soul for soul. The cycle must continue. The room pulsed around us, walls contracting like a heartbeat. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, charged with anticipation. 308 was waiting for its sacrifice. I looked from the knife to the woman's expectant face. She had been innocent, her life stolen by hands that were somehow mine across the gulf of decades. Did I owe her this debt? Would killing her again, or letting her kill me, satisfy 308's hunger, or merely feed an endless cycle of violence? "There has to be another way," I said, desperation lending my voice strength. "A way to break the cycle, not continue it." The clerk's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those empty eyes, uncertainty, perhaps. Or fear. 308 must be fed, he repeated, but his voice lacked its former conviction. The dripping woman tilted her head, studying me with newfound interest. "No one has ever questioned the cycle before," she said, wonder mixing with suspicion in her tone. "They either kill or are killed. That is the way of 308. An idea began to form, terrible, dangerous, but possibly the only way out. If 308 needed blood, needed death to sustain its cycle, perhaps there was a third option. A sacrifice that might satisfy its hunger while breaking the pattern. I turned the knife in my hand, feeling its weight, its deadly promise. Not toward the woman, but toward myself. Not in surrender, but in defiance. What if neither of us dies tonight? I asked, meeting the clerk's gaze. What if 308 feeds on a different sacrifice? Alarm registered on his face for the first time. "That is not how it works," he said quickly, reaching for the knife. "The cycle must be maintained. The roles must be fulfilled." I stepped back, keeping the blade out of his reach. "You're part of this too, aren't you? Not just a facilitator. A participant." I studied his gaunt features, seeing them clearly for the first time. "How long have you been feeding 308? How many cycles have you witnessed? Arranged?" His composure slipped further, revealing something ancient and terrible beneath the human facade. "I serve as I have always served," he said, his voice taking on an unnatural resonance. "Since the first blood stained this ground. Since 308 first hungered." The dripping woman's eyes widened with dawning comprehension. "He's the anchor," she whispered. The constant in every cycle. While we die and return, he remains, ensuring 308 is fed. The room trembled around us, walls bulging inward as if straining to listen. The air grew charged with static electricity, raising the hair on my arms. If 308 needs blood, I said, raising the knife, let it be the blood of its servant, not its victims. The clerk's face contorted with rage and fear. You cannot break the cycle, he hissed, lunging for me with unexpected speed. 308 will not be denied. I sidestepped his rush, sending him crashing into the dresser. The knife remained firm in my grip, its purpose now clear. Not to take life in mindless repetition of ancient sins, but to sever the tie that bound 308 to its endless cycle of death and return. The dripping woman moved to block the door, preventing the clerk's escape. Her expression held the fierce joy of vengeance long denied. The cycle ends tonight, she said, water streaming from her outstretched hands as if she were melting into the very substance of the room. 308 will feed, but not as before. The clerk scrambled to his feet, his human appearance slipping further. His skin seemed to ripple and sag, revealing glimpses of something else beneath, something ancient and malformed, sustained through countless years by 308's dark energies. Fools, he spat, his voice oscillating between human speech and something guttural and alien. You cannot destroy what has always been. 308 existed before this land had name, before your kind walked upright. It will exist long after your souls are dust. He launched himself at me again, fingers curved into talons. This time I wasn't quick enough. His weight slammed me against the wall, driving the breath from my lungs. Cold hands closed around my throat, squeezing with inhuman strength. The knife clattered from my grasp, sliding across the floor out of reach. Spots danced before my eyes as oxygen deprivation set in. Through dimming vision, I saw the dripping woman move toward us, her form growing less substantial with each step, dissolving into a swirling mist that enveloped the clerk from behind. His grip faltered as he thrashed against this new attack. I broke free, gasping for air, lunging for the fallen knife. My fingers closed around the handle just as the clerk tore himself from the mist's embrace, his appearance now barely human, skin hanging in loose folds, eyes sunken into cavernous sockets, mouth a lipless gash revealing too many teeth. 308 provides my immortality, he rasped, circling me warily. In exchange for fresh souls, fresh suffering. A bargain made before your bloodline began. A bargain that ends tonight, I replied, the knife steady in my hand. He laughed, the sound like breaking glass. You think you're the first to try? To rebel against 308's will? The room always wins. The cycle always continues. Maybe, I acknowledged. But I'm not playing by the old rules anymore. I feinted toward him, then slashed sideways, opening a cut on my own arm instead. Blood welled, dripping onto the carpet. The room shuddered in response, the walls rippling like disturbed water. The clerk's eyes widened with genuine fear. What are you doing? Offering 308 a choice, I said, letting my blood fall freely. My sacrifice, freely given. Not taken in violence, but offered in defiance of your cycle. The dripping woman's mist surrounded me, cool and comforting rather than threatening. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, yes. A willing sacrifice. Something 308 has never tasted before. The room began to transform around us, the walls pulsing with increasing intensity. The floor trembled. The air grew thick with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Stop this, the clerk shrieked, his form deteriorating further as 308's attention shifted. The cycle must continue. It must. I slashed my other arm, grimacing at the pain but committed to my course. 308 has fed on stolen lives for too long, I said. Let it taste freedom instead. Let it know what it means to release rather than possess. My blood pooled on the carpet, spreading outward in a pattern that seemed deliberate rather than random. The room absorbed it eagerly, the stain vanishing as quickly as it formed. With each drop, the clerk's appearance became more monstrous, more decrepit, as if his immortality were leaking away along with my blood. No, he wailed, falling to his knees as his body began to crumble like ancient parchment. I have served faithfully. I have fed you for centuries. The dripping woman's mist solidified partially, her face forming just long enough to smile in terrible triumph. The debt is paid, she said. Not with death for death, but with freedom for imprisonment. The room exploded into light and sound, a maelstrom of energy centered on the dissolving form of the clerk. He screamed as his body collapsed inward, centuries of unnatural existence reclaimed in an instant. Where he had knelt remained only dust and the knife, now tarnished and pitted as if it had aged decades in seconds. The walls of 308 shuddered one final time, then went still. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by ordinary motel air, stale and slightly musty, but no longer charged with malevolent anticipation. The dripping woman stood before me, her form solid again but changed, the water gone, the wound healed, her eyes clear and human once more. It's over, she said, wonder in her voice. 308 has accepted your offering. The cycle is broken. I looked down at my arms, expecting to see the wounds I'd inflicted, but my skin was unmarked. No blood, no cuts, as if the sacrifice had been symbolic rather than physical. What happens now? I asked. She smiled, the expression transforming her face from vengeful spirit to simply human. Now we move on. All of us. Those who killed. Those who died. Even 308 itself. She gestured to the room around us, which seemed small and now ordinary, just dated wallpaper and worn carpet. And you? Where will you go? Where I should have gone decades ago, she replied, already beginning to fade around the edges. Beyond. Away from this crossroads. Her form grew more transparent with each word. Thank you for breaking the cycle. For all of us. She dissolved into light, not water this time, a gentle radiance that spread throughout the room before fading to ordinary darkness. I was alone in 308, with only a pile of dust and an ancient knife as evidence of what had transpired. Outside, dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the curtains. The motel was silent, no dripping, no whispers, no sense of malevolent observation. Just an aging roadside stop, unremarkable in the early morning light. I opened the door and stepped onto the exterior walkway. The world looked different somehow, clearer, more vibrant, as if a filter had been removed from my perception. The parking lot below was empty save for my car, waiting patiently where I had left it. As I descended the stairs, I glanced back at room 308. Just a door with tarnished brass numbers, slightly askew. From the outside, no one would ever guess what had dwelled within, what cycles of death and return had played out across decades. Or that, for the first time in centuries, those cycles had been broken. Have you ever woken from a nightmare so vivid that reality seems pale in comparison? 2 weeks had passed since my encounter with room 308. 2 weeks of questioning my sanity, of wondering if the events at the Pinewood Motel had been some elaborate hallucination born of exhaustion and isolation. 2 weeks of jumping at shadows and flinching at the sound of dripping water. I had driven away from the motel that morning without looking back, putting miles between myself and Nebraska with single-minded determination. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened in 308, real or imagined, was behind me now. But the dreams hadn't stopped. Each night, I returned to that room in fragments of disjointed imagery, walls that breathed, water that dripped upward, a knife that changed hands through decades of violence. I would wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the echo of the dripping woman's voice lingering in my ears. The cycle is broken. We can move on now. But had it been broken? Or had 308 merely adapted, finding a new way to continue its feed, a new method to ensure the cycle of violence persisted? I sat in my apartment in Chicago, staring at the laptop screen where dozens of browser tabs displayed research into the Pinewood Motel. Its history was unremarkable on the surface, built in 1959, family-owned until the late 80s, then sold to a succession of corporate entities. Nothing about disappearances. Nothing about room 308 specifically. But there were gaps. Periods where the motel simply vanished from public record, only to reappear years later under new management. And buried in local newspaper archives, I found them, the missing pieces. Brief mentions of travelers who had vanished along that stretch of highway. Reports of strange sounds from the motel, quickly dismissed as pranks or infrastructural issues. A fire in 1976 that had supposedly destroyed the North Wing, including room 308, only for it to be mysteriously intact in later photographs. Most telling was a series of unexplained deaths spanning decades, motel employees, all described as night clerks, found withered and aged beyond their years, as if something had drained the life from them overnight. The most recent had been discovered just 2 weeks ago, the morning after my stay. The article described him as desiccated and mummified, though he had been seen alive by other motel guests the previous evening. I closed the laptop, unable to look at the evidence any longer. It had been real. All of it. The room, the clerk, the dripping woman, the cycle of violence that had bound us all together through time. And I had done something no one else had managed. I had broken that cycle, offering myself as a willing sacrifice rather than continuing the pattern of killer and victim. But at what cost? Since that night, I had felt different. Not physically, no wounds remained from my confrontation in 308, but something fundamental had changed within me. As if part of my essence had been left behind in that room, replaced by something older, something that understood concepts beyond human comprehension. I found myself noticing things I never had before. The way shadows sometimes moved independently of their casters. How certain places seemed to resonate with emotional residue, memories of events I couldn't possibly have witnessed. The way strangers sometimes looked at me with recognition in their eyes, though we had never met in this life. My phone rang, startling me from my reverie. Unknown caller. My finger hovered over the decline button, remembering the static-filled call on the highway. But something compelled me to answer. Hello? Silence greeted me, then a soft exhalation. Not threatening, but relieved. Familiar. You made it home, said the dripping woman's voice, though she no longer sounded waterlogged. Her tone was clear, human, with a warmth I hadn't heard before. My heart hammered against my ribs. How did you get this number? I thought you moved on. I did, she replied. Most of me, anyway. But 308 leaves its mark on all who encounter it. A fragment remains, connecting us across the divide. Why are you calling me? I asked, unsure whether to be frightened or comforted by her presence. To warn you, she said, her voice growing more distant with each word. 308 is gone, but what sustained it isn't. What lived in that room has existed since before human memory. It will find a new vessel, a new cycle. Cold dread pulled in my stomach. What are you saying? The night clerk wasn't the first servant, just the longest lasting. There will be others. There always are. How will I know? How can I stop it? Her laugh was gentle, almost sad. You already know. You've carried a piece of 308 with you since that night. It's why you see differently now, why you sense things others can't. I glanced at my reflection in a darkened laptop screen. My face looked the same, but there was something new in my eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before, a knowledge too ancient for my 32 years. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked. Whatever you choose, she replied. That's the gift and the curse of breaking the cycle. Free will. The clerk chose to serve. You chose to sacrifice. What comes next is your decision alone. The line began to fill with static, her voice fading into electronic noise. Wait. I called. I don't even know your name. Through the growing interference, her final words reached me clearly. Margaret. My name was Margaret. Remember me, but don't look for me. I won't be back. The call ended. When I checked my recent calls list, there was no record of it ever happening. That night, I dreamed of 308 for the last time. Not the room as I had experienced it, but as it had been through centuries, a place of power long before the motel was built, before the road was laid, before European settlers ever set foot on the continent. I saw it as a clearing where indigenous peoples left offerings to appease something they sensed dwelling in the earth. As a campsite where Spanish explorers mysteriously vanished, leaving only blood-stained journals. As a homestead where a family turned on each other with inexplicable violence. Always the same spot. Always the same hunger for suffering and sacrifice. In the dream, I stood outside myself, watching as each iteration of the cycle played out. The names and faces changed, but the pattern remained constant until my arrival broke it. Until I offered myself willingly, neither killer nor victim, but something else entirely. A third option 308 had never encountered in all its long existence. I woke with the first light of dawn, more rested than I had been since fleeing the Pinewood. The dreams were done. 308 had released me, just as I had released it. But the knowledge remained. The awareness that such places existed in the world, crossroads where ancient hungers met human frailty, where cycles of violence perpetuated themselves through willing or unwitting servants. My phone chimed with a news alert. A series of disappearances in a small town in Vermont centered around a historic covered bridge. Local authorities baffled. Witnesses reporting strange lights and sounds in the night. Another cycle beginning. Another hunger awakening. I stared at the screen for a long moment, weighing the knowledge 308 had left within me against my desire to return to normal life. I could ignore this. Pretend I had never seen beyond the veil of ordinary reality. Live the comfortable life of blissful ignorance. Or I could act. Use what I had learned to break other cycles, to offer alternatives to the binary of perpetrator and prey. The choice was mine alone. That was the final gift of Room 308, the freedom to choose my own role in whatever came next. I packed a bag, booked a flight to Vermont, and left my apartment without looking back. Not running away this time, but moving towards something with purpose. In the taxi to the airport, I caught my reflection in the window. Behind my shoulder, Just for an instant, I thought I saw Margaret's face, no longer dripping, no longer vengeful. She smiled, nodded once in approval, and was gone. 308 had taken something from me that night in Nebraska. But it had given something in return, a purpose, a mission, a way to ensure that what had happened in that room for centuries would not be repeated elsewhere. The cycle was broken, but the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Sometimes, the most terrifying truth isn't what waits for us in haunted rooms, it's what we carry with us when we leave. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.